As the night settles in, so can you. Let us know in the comments, where are you listening this and what is your current time. After that, close your eyes if you like. Nothing we're about to discuss is urgent or even particularly interesting. And let us begin. You yank your woolen cloak tighter around your shoulders, bracing against the biting wind that whistles through the trees of 18th century Sweden. Welcome to your life as a miner, where the chill isn't just in the air, but in the very marrow of your bones. The dawn barely breaks before your day begins, the horizon painted in hues of grey and steel. You might think the life of a Swedish miner is all pickaxes and underground adventures, but let's set the record straight. It's more survival tactic than treasure hunt. Your day kicks off before the rooster gets the memo. As the sun edges over the horizon, you, along with your fellow miners, are already trudging toward the mouth of the cave. This isn't your backyard gold rush. It's gritty, it's grimy, and it's about as glamorous as a mud pie. Mining is the economic engine of Sweden right now, and you, my friend, are one of its many cogs. It's copper that fuels this beast, copper that will be minted into the coins that jingle in your pocket. If you stand very still, you can almost hear the faint clink of copper against copper, a sound both tantalizing and taunting. Now, let's talk about the pay, because who doesn't love a good chat about wages? Ironically, you're paid in the very copper you extract. It's like being paid in slices of cake for baking it. But before you imagine a Scrooge McDuck-style vault filled with copper coins, let's burst that bubble. Your wage barely covers the essentials. Think less rolling in riches and more scraping by. The average miner earns enough to keep the family clothed and fed, but not much else. And what you earn has to be stretched thin, like the last bit of butter on too much bread. The mine itself, a labyrinthine world of tunnels and shafts, dark and damp. You navigate it with a lamp flickering on the end of a stick, your only guide in this underground maze. It's a place where time seems to stand still, even as your muscles ache from the relentless work. You chip away at the rock face, each swing of the pickaxe a small rebellion against the encroaching exhaustion. And while it might sound like a medieval nightmare, this was the reality for thousands of miners. There's no romantic glow here, just the cold, hard truth of survival. And speaking of survival, let's chat about the miner's diet. Spoiler alert, it's about as exciting as the tunnels themselves. Rye bread, salted herring, and the occasional potato if you're lucky. It's a diet that would make any modern foodie weep into their avocado toast. But in this world, food is fuel, not a luxury. It keeps you on your feet as you haul copper from the depths of the earth, day in and day out. But why copper, you ask? Why not silver or gold? Well, in the 18th century, copper was king in Sweden. The country was one of Europe's primary suppliers, and this reddish-brown metal was the lifeblood of the economy. It was turned into coins, cannonballs, and cookware, anything that could be shaped, moulded, or minted. Sweden's copper was a hot commodity, and its value went far beyond the mines. It was deeply entwined with political power and influence, a shining example of how a seemingly humble metal could have a royal impact. Yet, for all its economic importance, the life of a miner was anything but regal. The work was back-breaking, and the hours were endless, a relentless march from one day to the next. But you did it because you had to, because it was a job, and any job was better than none. So, as you stand in the mine, pickaxe in hand, you're not just mining copper, you're mining a future, however uncertain it might be. Now, as the sun sets and you make your way back home, there's a peculiar satisfaction in your step. Sure, it's not the stuff of legends, but it's your life, and it's real. You take a moment to glance at the sky, where the stars peek through the canvas of night. Tomorrow, it all begins again. The chill, the grind, the hope tucked into each copper coin. Welcome to your 18th century Swedish adventure, where history is as much about the struggle as it is about the story. Before you cozy up under your scratchy woolen blanket, let's dive deeper into the world of 18th century Swedish mining, where the real treasure wasn't just the copper, but the sheer tenacity it took to extract it. Forget your modern-day hard hats and high-vis vests. Here, it's more about hoping your candle doesn't flicker out and praying the ceiling doesn't decide to join you on the floor. Let's talk tools of the trade. Imagine yourself armed with a pickaxe, a candle, and a whole lot of bravado. That's right, Your primary weapon against the unyielding rock and pervasive darkness was a pickaxe, a tool that's about as subtle as a sledgehammer. Each swing was a testament to your endurance, and let's be honest, your desperation. Lighter than its modern counterpart, this pickaxe was designed for maximum repetition, because who wouldn't want to spend countless hours chipping away at rock that's as stubborn as a mule? The candle, your beacon in the bowels of the earth, was about as reliable as a one-legged stool. Made from tallow, it was notorious for its weak flame and acrid smoke. You'd stick it on your hat or hold it in your hand, creating an eerie dance of shadows on the cavern walls. Romantic? Sure, if you're into ghost stories. But, in reality, this was your lifeline to the surface world, a flickering reminder of both your isolation and connection. As for safety measures, well, let's just say they were more of an afterthought. Mine collapses were as common as morning fog, and ventilation was achieved by, get this, lighting fires at the bottom of the shafts to create an updraft. Yes, you heard that right, smoke out the tunnels to bring in fresh air. It was ingenious in a way that makes you marvel at human creativity while simultaneously questioning our survival instincts. And speaking of survival instincts, let's address the myth of the canary in the coal mine. While our feathered friends were later used in coal mines to detect lethal gases, this wasn't a practice in copper mines of Sweden. Here, it was your nose that had to do the sniffing for danger, and if it caught a whiff of something sulphurous, it was time to beat a hasty retreat. Moving on to technological innovations, or the lack thereof. The 18th century wasn't exactly the golden age of mining technology. The mechanization that would later revolutionize industries was still a distant dream. Water pumps, essential to keeping mines from becoming subterranean swimming pools, were manually operated or powered by water wheels, which were as temperamental as Swedish weather. When they worked, they were a godsend. When they didn't, well, you had yourself a new underground lake to navigate. Now, if you're thinking about personal protective equipment, stop right there. Miners' clothes were simple and functional. Wool and linen garments were the norm, offering some protection against the cold but not much else. Helmets were as foreign as space travel, and gloves, a luxury most couldn't afford. It was bare hands on rough rock, leaving you with calluses that were practically badges of honor. The conditions were harsh, the risks high, and the rewards meager. Yet, despite all this, there was a certain rough-hewn pride in the work. Mining was dangerous, yes, but it was also a craft, a skill honed through years of toil. You learned to read the rock, to understand its moods and secrets. You became a part of something larger, a cog in Sweden's economic machine, driven by the relentless demand for copper. But why did they keep digging, you ask? Because, like the rest of us, they were chasing a dream of a better life, of security, of something more than just survival. The copper might not have made you rich, but it was a ticket to a future, however uncertain. It was a promise that tomorrow could be better, that the sweat and the grit would someday pay off. So, as you lay down your pickaxe and head home, remember this. In the dank, dangerous depths of the mine, miners weren't just extracting metal. They were forging futures, shaping destinies, and writing their own indelible chapters in the grand story of human perseverance. The candle may have flickered in the darkness, but the spirit of the miner burned brightly, a testament to the indomitable will that drives us all. It's the finish of another grueling day, and as you emerge from the mine, the crisp Swedish air feels like an old friend, albeit one with a bit too much bite. But don't get too comfortable. There's more to this mining gig than just swinging a pickaxe. The real drama unfolds above ground, where the entire community revolves around this subterranean world. Let's dive into the social tapestry of 18th century Swedish miner life, a patchwork quilt stitched together by necessity and shared hardship. In these mining towns, the term close-knit doesn't even begin to cover it. Imagine living in a community where everyone knows everyone else's business, because they kind of have to. These weren't just villages, they were lifelines. Without a good neighbour to lean on, you might find yourself in a tighter spot than the mine shaft during a cave-in. Here, your neighbour was also your co-worker, your trading partner, and, on occasion, the only person around with a spare loaf of rye bread. It was a social safety net woven from necessity rather than choice. Now let's talk about the family dynamic, which was less leave it to beaver and more little house on the prairie, but with less sunshine and more soot. In this setting, the family wasn't just a unit, it was a production team. Remember those mystical days off from school you enjoyed as a kid? Well, for the miners' children, Bring Your Kid to Work Day was every day, and it wasn't about bonding experiences over a packed lunch. It was about survival. Toddlers might be sweeping up coal dust or fetching tools, while older kids were learning the ropes, literally, of mine work. By the age of 12, many were already full-fledged members of the workforce. Think of it as an apprenticeship program with a lot less paperwork and a lot more risk. Grandparents, too, were woven into this fabric of labour. While their days of descending into the mine might be behind them, they played crucial roles in keeping the household running. They might tend to livestock, manage the small plot of land, or pass down the skills and stories that kept the family and the community grounded. Retirement, as a concept, was as foreign as air conditioning. You worked until you couldn't, and then you found other ways to contribute. So, let's debunk that myth of the picturesque village life, shall we? The idea of a peaceful hamlet with everyone living in harmonious bliss is as fictitious as a fairy tale. In reality, living in a mining community was a constant dance with uncertainty. A bad season, an accident, or a drop in copper prices could spell disaster. It was a delicate balance of working hard and hoping harder. The only thing more common than the soot-streaked faces were the lines of worry etched into them. And here's a bit of reality check for those who romanticize the simple life. Yes, life was simpler in that it didn't involve email inboxes or clogged freeways, but it was by no means easy. There was a constant undercurrent of struggle. You didn't just work to live, you lived to work. And this work wasn't a 9-to-5 affair with weekends off. It was a relentless cycle that demanded everything and then some. The community held tight because it had to, because in this harsh world you could either band together or fall apart. But why did they stay? Why did families continue to dig into the earth generation after generation? Simple. The mine was a cruel but consistent provider. It was steady work in a world where steady was a rare commodity. The mine offered a kind of stability, however precarious, that was hard to come by elsewhere. It was the bronze thread that tied together lives, hopes, and futures, however dim they may have seemed. And so, as you stand at the edge of your small village, looking out over the hills that seem to swallow the sun each night, you understand. You see why this place, for all its hardships, is home. You see the hope in the eyes of the children, the determination in the posture of the adults, and the wisdom etched in the faces of the elderly. It's a life lived on the edge, but it's life nonetheless, and it's yours. So here's to the miners and their families, the unsung heroes of the 18th century who kept the wheels of industry turning with bare hands and stubborn hearts. They remind us that history isn't just a series of grand events and famous figures. It's the story of everyday people doing extraordinary things just to get by, and in that, there's a certain kind of heroism that's as real as it gets. As the village settles into the quiet of the night, you feel a part of something larger than yourself. It's not perfect, but it's real. And tomorrow, as the sun rises once more over the Swedish hills, you'll pick up your tools and join your community in the endless march forward. Because in this world, that's all there is to do. Keep moving, keep hoping, keep digging. But as you lace up your boots and head into another day's labour, let's unravel the political quagmire that defined your reality. If mining was the backbone of Sweden's economy, then politics was its fickle heart, pumping lifeblood, or draining it, depending on the whims of those in power. Welcome to the 18th century, where the world was your chessboard, and you, my friend, were more pawn than player. Let's set the stage. Sweden in the 1700s was an economic powerhouse, but not because of its lush landscapes or abundant farmland. Nope, it was the copper mines that made Sweden a key player on the European stage. You see, copper wasn't just a metal, it was currency. It lined the coffers of kings and fueled the fires of war. Sweden's copper output was so significant that by the mid-1600s it accounted for 2/3 of Europe's production. Talk about putting all your eggs in one mineral-laden basket. Now, the government knew exactly what side its bread was buttered on. They couldn't afford to let the copper mines run dry, so they took a keen interest in maximizing output. Enter the Bergscollegium, a regulatory body established in 1637 with a mouthful of a name that essentially means Board of Mines. Their job? To ensure that Sweden's mineral wealth kept flowing like a well-oiled machine. And by well-oiled, I mean they regulated the mines with the same finesse A cat herds kittens, with more chaos than control. You might think this oversight would lead to improved conditions for miners, right? Well, hold your horses, or should I say, hold your pickaxes. The regulatory measures were less about worker welfare and more about squeezing every last drop of metal from the ground. The Bergscollegium implemented strict quotas, pushing miners to extract more ore at breakneck speeds. It wasn't about making life easier underground, it was about fueling a national strategy that saw Sweden as a copper mecca. In other words, if you thought your supervisor was tough, imagine having an entire government breathing down your neck. Political decisions trickled down to the mines like a leaky faucet, sometimes a slow drip, other times a deluge. When the government needed more copper to back new currency or fund military campaigns, you felt the pressure. It was the classic case of more work, same pay, but on a national scale. The state's demand for revenue essentially turned miners into cogs in a vast economic engine, revving up whenever the nation needed to flex its financial muscles. And what about the miners? They were left to navigate this political minefield, often finding themselves at the mercy of decisions made far above their pay grade. Imagine being a miner and hearing about new taxes being levied on copper exports. Good news, right? Not quite. While these taxes theoretically supported national interests, they also meant your employer might cut costs elsewhere, like, say, your wages. It was a balancing act, where you weren't just walking a tightrope, you were trying to do it blindfolded with a pickaxe in hand. Speaking of taxes, let's talk about the infamous Kopparmynfot, or copper standard. In the 17th and 18th centuries, Sweden briefly adopted a monetary system where copper coins were the norm. You'd think this would lead to prosperity for the miners, swimming in a sea of copper-coloured coins. But here's the kicker. Copper coins were massive. Some weighed over 19 kilograms. Imagine hauling those around to buy a loaf of bread. It was an economic strategy that was more cumbersome than clever, and it often left miners scratching their heads. So, what about regulation, or the lack thereof? The state's approach to mine safety was about as hands-off as a parent with a kid at summer camp. The focus was on output, not the conditions that yielded it. Sure, there were rules to follow, but enforcement was as spotty as a Dalmatian. Miners learned to navigate these murky waters, relying on their own wits and communal knowledge rather than any official guidance. It was a system that valued profits over people, turning a blind eye to the daily dangers faced by those digging out the nation's wealth. In this high-stakes game, miners often felt like mere pawns, moved around the board by forces beyond their control. The politics of mining was a tangled web, where every decision had repercussions that rippled through the communities that fed and clothed the nation. It was a world where power dynamics were as solid as shifting sands, and miners were left to weather the changes, hoping the next political breeze wouldn't flatten their livelihoods. But why did they stay, you ask? Because despite the hardships, there was always the glimmer of hope. A better life for their children. A future where the copper they mined might just turn into a golden opportunity. It was the lure of stability in a world of uncertainty, the promise of a tomorrow that made today's toil worthwhile. As you mull over these political machinations, remember this. The story of Sweden's mining industry isn't just about metal and money. It's about people, everyday heroes who carved out a living from the unforgiving earth, fueled by resilience and a stubborn refusal to back down in the face of adversity. The mines may have been dark and dangerous, but the spirit of those who worked them burned bright, a testament to their enduring strength. And so, as you head back to the familiar embrace of your village, the political winds swirling around you, know that you're part of a legacy, one built not just on copper, but on courage and community. It's a story still unfolding, with new chapters waiting to be written as history marches ever forward. As you head back to the familiar embrace of your village, the political winds swirling around you, it's time to gaze into the rearview mirror of history and examine the legacy left behind by those Swedish miners. Spoiler alert, it's not just a pile of rocks and copper coins. These miners, with their grit and grime, shaped Sweden far beyond the confines of their subterranean workplaces. Their work laid the foundation for Sweden's transition from a medieval economy to a modern industrial powerhouse, and their legacy is as solid as the ore they extracted. Let's start with the cold, hard facts. By the 18th century, Sweden was producing 2/3 of Europe's copper. a statistic that still has economists and historians nodding in appreciation or disbelief, depending on their caffeine levels. This wasn't just a metal, this was the currency of progress. Copper from Sweden was minted into coins, cast into cannons, and spread across the continent like a metallic web of influence. The miners' labour turned Sweden into a player on the global stage, a feat as impressive as juggling flaming swords while blindfolded. The economic impact is undeniable. Mining towns sprouted up like mushrooms after a rainstorm, becoming bustling hubs of commerce and community. These towns weren't just about mining, they were about creating an ecosystem where trade and industry could flourish. The miners' work fueled local economies, creating demand for goods and services that rippled across the country. Markets emerged, businesses thrived, and suddenly Sweden wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. And this wasn't just about the bottom line. It was about building a society where opportunity was as plentiful as the copper veins running beneath the ground. But what about the social fabric? Here's where the story gets interesting. These miners weren't just labourers, they were community builders. Mining towns became melting pots of cultures and ideas, with people coming from all corners of Sweden and beyond in search of work. This diversity fostered a unique social tapestry, one woven with threads of resilience and camaraderie, in a world where the only certainty was the uncertainty of what tomorrow might bring. These communities banded together, supporting each other in ways that make modern-day social networks look like a weak handshake. And let's not forget the role of women, who often get left out of the narrative. While the men toiled underground, women held the communities together with the tenacity of superglue. They managed households, raised children, and often took on additional work to make ends meet. In doing so, they shaped the social landscape, ensuring that the wheels of these mining towns didn't just keep turning, they accelerated. It's high time we give them the credit they deserve, for without their contribution, the story of Swedish mining would be a much poorer tale. Now, let's tackle the myths head-on, shall we? The romanticized notion of the noble miner, toiling away heroically against the odds, is a tale as old as time and just as fraught with embellishment. It paints a picture of valiant workers emerging from the depths like triumphant gladiators. But here's the reality check. Mining was dirty, dangerous, and downright grueling. There was no hero's welcome at the end of a shift, just sore muscles and the promise of doing it all over again tomorrow. Yet the myth persists, and there's a reason for that. It speaks to something deeply human, a yearning for stories of perseverance, of overcoming adversity, of triumph against the odds. The truth may be gritty, but the legend is polished to a shine. It's the stuff of folklore, where the harsh edges are smoothed out in favour of a narrative that celebrates the indomitable spirit of the human soul. And perhaps, in some small way, it's a tribute to the miners themselves, who, despite the odds, continued to chip away at their own legacies. So, what's the takeaway from this saga of sweat and stone? It's a testament to human resilience, a nod to the tenacity that drives us forward even when the odds are stacked as high as a slag heap. The miners of 18th century Sweden were more than just workers. They were pioneers of progress, architects of an economy that would carry Sweden into the modern age. Their humour and camaraderie, their ability to find light in the darkest of places, is a reminder that even in the toughest of times, laughter and hope can be as valuable as the richest ore. As we wrap up this exploration of mining life, let's raise a virtual glass to those who came before us, to the miners who carved out more than just tunnels, they carved out a future. Their legacy lives on in the strength of Sweden's economy, in the communities that still bear the marks of their labour, and in the stories that continue to be told. It's a legacy forged in fire and sweat, a reminder that history is not just a collection of dates and events, but a tapestry woven from the lives of those who dared to dream of something more. So, next time you find yourself stuck in the daily grind, think of those miners. Remember their resilience, their humour, and their unwavering spirit. Because if they could find hope in the depths of the earth, there's no reason we can't find it in our own lives, wherever we may dig. In the bustling chaos of ancient Greece, where sandals slapped stone streets and toga-clad philosophers argued about the nature of existence, a new power was quietly forging its future, not with wood and water. The Greeks were becoming masters of the sea, and their weapon of choice? The trireme, a sleek, speedy vessel that would eventually become the backbone of their naval dominance. Now, before we get swept away by the romantic image of fearless sailors and epic sea battles, Let's cut through the waves of myth and examine the nuts and bolts, or rather, the planks and oars of this maritime marvel. The trireme wasn't your average ship, it was the Ferrari of the ancient world. And by Ferrari, I mean it was costly, high maintenance, and absolutely essential for showing off. Each trireme measured about 120 feet long and 18 feet wide, a narrow design that sliced through the water like an arrow. It carried up to 170 rowers, stacked in 3 tiers, huddling together like sardines in a wooden can. These rowers weren't just any old seafarers, they were highly trained athletes. Picture a cross between a modern-day Olympic rowing team and a group of caffeine-fueled college students, and you're getting close. But why all the fuss about these floating muscle machines? Well, the Athenian city-state, in particular, had a thing for naval power. This wasn't just about keeping up with the Spartans next door. It was about control, influence, and, quite frankly, a little bit of that ancient Greek swagger. Athens wasn't just building a fleet, it was constructing a legacy. The city poured resources into its navy like a college student invests in ramen noodles during finals week. And just like those noodles, the fleet was a lifeline. The financial implications of this naval obsession were enormous. Maintaining a single trireme cost about 1 talent per month, a unit of currency equivalent to the weight of a fully grown man in silver. Multiply that by the hundreds of triremes Athens boasted, and you've got a budget that even the most extravagant spenders would balk at. This wasn't just pocket change to be casually tossed into the Aegean, it was a full-blown financial commitment that required a complex system of taxation and state-sponsored funding. The wealthy citizens, those who could afford to commission a trireme, often did so to earn social and political clout, a practice known as liturgies. Think of it as the ancient Greek version of sponsoring a little league team, except with more water and fewer orange slices. But what did Athens, or any Greek city-state for that matter, get in return for this heavy investment? Quite a bit, actually. The strategic advantages were as vast as the sea itself. A well-equipped fleet could protect trade routes, project power across the Mediterranean and, most crucially, keep those pesky Persian invaders at bay. The famous Battle of Salamis in 480 BCE is a prime example of how these tactics paid off. With their nimble triremes, the Greeks managed to outmaneuver the larger Persian fleet in the cramped straits, turning the tide of war in their favour. It was a bit like watching a skilled chess player checkmate an opponent with a single, unexpected move. Of course, the legend of Greek naval prowess isn't entirely free of embellishment. The image of perfectly coordinated rowers and daring commanders makes for great storytelling, but reality had its messy moments. The cramped conditions on board were less heroic adventure and more fraternity house after a party. Rowers, often from the lower rungs of society, spent hours at a time packed together, their only respite the occasional glimpse of sunlight through the oar ports. Hygiene on board was, well, let's just say, it left much to be desired. If you've ever been stuck on a long-haul flight with a broken air conditioner, you'll have some sympathy for these ancient mariners. Still, despite the less than glamorous conditions, the trireme and its crew represented the cutting edge of naval warfare, a testament to the ingenuity and determination of the Greeks. They weren't just fighting for territory, they were defending a way of life, and the trireme was their weapon of choice. In the end, the combination of strategic savvy, economic investment, and sheer human endurance made the Greek naval tactics a force to be reckoned with. As we continue to explore this saga of the sea, remember, behind every epic tale of heroism is a story of hard work, innovation, and occasionally a little bit of ancient Greek luck. And speaking of hard work and innovation, let's dive headfirst into the frothy waters of the Battle of Salamis, one of history's most celebrated naval clashes. Now, if you think this was just your run-of-the-mill, ships-at-sea battle, think again. The stakes were as high as a Greek philosopher's toga, and the drama was thicker than Athenian olive oil. Picture this. It's 480 BC, and the mighty Persian Empire, led by King Xerxes, is knocking on Greece's door with a fleet that's less of a navy and more of a floating city. Xerxes wasn't just bringing a few ships for a casual cruise. He had amassed a naval armada of around 1,200 vessels. That's enough timber to make a modern environmentalist weep. And the Greeks? They were outnumbered, with a fleet totaling around 270 triremes. It was the maritime equivalent of David versus Goliath, but trust me, it wasn't about to play out like your usual Sunday school story. The Greeks had a secret weapon, no, and no, it wasn't some divine intervention from the gods of Mount Olympus. It was geography. The narrow straits of Salamis were the perfect stage for a Greek comeback. The Persian fleet, with its numerical advantage, was like a sumo wrestler trying to dance ballet in a broom closet. The cramped confines of the strait neutralized their numbers, making it a game of tactics over brute force. Enter Themistocles, the Athenian mastermind whose strategic brilliance would make even the craftiest tactician nod in approval. Unlike the larger-than-life heroes of legend, Themistocles was more brain than brawn. His plan was simple, yet cunning: draw the Persian fleet into the straits, where their overwhelming numbers would become a liability. It was a classic bait-and-switch, the naval edition. And let's not forget about the element of surprise. While the Persian fleet was busy trying to maneuver in the tight waters, the Greeks were ready to pounce like a cat on a laser pointer. The triremes, with their sleek design and nimble agility, darted in and out, delivering hit-and-run attacks that left the Persian ships reeling. It was a masterclass in guerrilla warfare, long before the term even existed. But let's take a step back from the glorious image of triumphant Greek sailors and examine the gritty details. These weren't battles fought in plush conditions with silk sails and gentle breezes. No, the reality was far less glamorous. The decks were slippery with salt and sweat, the air thick with shouts and the tang of fear. And those rowers? They weren't just pulling oars, they were pulling history along with them, straining against the tide of empire. The battle itself was a cacophony of chaos. Ships collided with bone-jarring force, the wooden hulls splintering like so many toothpicks underfoot. The sounds of clashing metal and the cries of men filled the air, a symphony of warfare that was as brutal as it was decisive. The Greeks, with their intimate knowledge of the local waters and their relentless resolve, managed to decimate the Persian fleet, sinking at least 200 of their ships. Now, let's bust a myth or two about this legendary encounter. Sure, heroism was on full display, but it wasn't all about valiant warriors standing tall amidst the fray. The truth is, naval warfare was as much about endurance and sheer human grit as it was about skill. The trireme crews were a motley crew of citizens and slaves, drawn from the lower echelons of society. Their lives weren't the stuff of epic poetry, they were the unsung labourers of war, the human engine powering the Athenian machine. And while Themistocles is often hailed as the hero of Salamis, it's worth noting that his rise to prominence was as much about political savvy as it was about strategic genius. The political landscape of Greece was a treacherous sea in its own right, where alliances shifted like sand underfoot. Themistocles had to navigate these waters with the skill of a seasoned diplomat, securing the support of various city-states that were, at best, fair-weather friends. So, what did the Greeks gain from this monumental victory? Well, aside from a much-needed morale boost and a healthy dose of relief, they secured the safety of their homeland, at least for a time. The Battle of Salamis was a turning point in the Greco-Persian wars, halting the Persian advance and setting the stage for further Greek resistance. It was a triumph of strategy over sheer numbers and a testament to the power of cunning over might. But let's not wrap this up with a neat little bow just yet. The story of Greek naval warfare is far from over. The Battle of Salamis was just one chapter in a larger saga of struggle, innovation, and resilience. The Greeks, ever resourceful, would continue to refine their tactics, adapting to new challenges as they arose. They were a people constantly at the brink, living on the edge of the known world, yet always pushing beyond it. So, as we prepare to sail further into this tale of ancient naval prowess, remember, behind every legendary battle and every celebrated victory lies a complex web of human endeavour, political intrigue, and, yes, a fair bit of serendipity. The Greeks may have fought for glory, but they also fought for survival, and in doing so they left an indelible mark on history. Stay tuned, because there's plenty more sea to navigate, and the waters are anything but calm. Now, speaking of navigating turbulent waters, let's dive into the political whirlpool that was ancient Greece. A place where city-states like Athens and Sparta were constantly eyeing each other like contestants in a reality TV show. Except, instead of roses, they were handing out alliances, and the drama was dialed up to epic proportions. The Athenian navy wasn't just a floating armada, it was a political tool, a symbol of power, and a catalyst for one of history's earliest experiments in democracy. Here's the scoop. Athens's obsession with its navy wasn't merely about keeping the Persians at arm's length or flexing its maritime muscles. It was about power, prestige, and the kind of political maneuvering that would make Machiavelli himself raise an eyebrow. The Athenians understood that control of the sea meant control of trade routes, and control of trade routes meant wealth flowing into their city like wine at a Dionysian festival. But with great power comes great political wrangling. The alliances that Athens forged were as slippery as the fish in its harbours. The Delian League, for instance, started as a coalition of Greek city-states united against the Persian threat. Picture it as an ancient version of NATO, but with more togas and fewer diplomatic protocols. Led by Athens, the League collected tribute from its members, ostensibly to maintain a common defence fund. However, as the Persian danger waned, Athens decided to keep the cash flowing, using it to bolster its navy and, build a few monuments. You might have heard of a little project called the Parthenon. This expansion of naval power wasn't just about fending off external threats, it was about internal dominance. Athens's fleet became the backbone of its imperial ambitions, allowing it to exert control over other Greek city-states. The Athenian navy morphed into a tool of coercion, ensuring that tribute kept coming in and that wayward allies stayed in line. It was the ancient equivalent of having a bunch of aircraft carriers parked off your coast. A not-so-subtle reminder of who was boss. Now, let's talk about how this naval prowess played into the rise of democracy in Athens. The Athenian political system was as turbulent as the seas they sailed. As naval power grew, so did the influence of the rowers, the thetes, who were the lowest class in the Athenian social hierarchy. Imagine a group of scrappy underdogs who suddenly found themselves essential to the city's survival. These rowers were the engine of the trireme, and their importance on the battlefield translated into political capital back home. The burgeoning navy led to a shift in political power. The thetes were no longer just the guys who did the heavy lifting. They were a political force to be reckoned with, demanding a say in how the city was run. Their contributions at sea bolstered their claims for more democratic reforms, nudging Athens toward a system where every citizen had a voice. A radical idea at the time. And here's where the myth-busting comes in. The rise of Athenian democracy wasn't just a noble evolution of political thought, it was fueled by practical needs and social pressures. The city needed its rowers, so it had to give them a reason to keep rowing. This wasn't an altruistic gift of political rights, it was a strategic adaptation to maintain stability and power. While we're setting the record straight, let's not forget the political machinations of Athenian leaders. Themistocles, that tactical genius of Salamis fame, was also a master of political games. He knew that keeping Athens at the forefront of naval power required not just strategy on the seas, but also deft maneuvering in the political arena. His efforts to fortify Athens's naval capabilities were as much about securing his own political position as they were about defending the city. Themistocles' story is a classic tale of rise and fall. His political savvy initially won him allies and influence, but it also earned him enemies. As is often the case in politics, the knives came out, and Themistocles was eventually ostracized, literally. He was exiled from Athens, a victim of the very democratic processes he helped to empower. Talk about irony. Moving beyond individual players, the broader socio-political landscape in Greece was a hotbed of rivalry and alliance. City-states like Corinth and Thebes had their own ambitions, and their relationships with Athens were a constant dance of diplomacy and discord. The Peloponnesian War, a protracted and bloody conflict between Athens and Sparta, was as much about these underlying tensions as it was about military might. It was a clash of ideologies, with Athens championing democracy and naval supremacy, while Sparta, the land-based military powerhouse, clung to its oligarchic ways. This war, which dragged on for nearly 3 decades, saw alliances shift like the tides. The Athenian navy was a formidable force, but over time the strain of endless campaigning and the shifting allegiances of other Greek states took their toll. The war's conclusion saw Athens's power diminished, its fleet decimated, and its democracy tested to its limits. Yet, despite the eventual decline, the legacy of Athenian naval power and the democratic principles it helped foster endured. The notion that ordinary citizens could wield influence in matters of state was a revolutionary idea, one that would echo through history and inspire future generations. The Athenian experiment was a testament to the power of innovation and adaptability, even if the path was fraught with turbulence. As we continue to navigate the choppy waters of Greek naval history, remember this. Behind every grand narrative of heroism and glory lies a complex web of human ambition, political intrigue, and the relentless march of progress. The seas of history are vast, and we've only begun to chart their depths. Stay tuned, because the saga of Greek naval tactics and the socio-political currents they spawned is far from over. And speaking of charting depths, let's dive into the nuts and bolts, or should I say, the planks and nails of Greek shipbuilding and navigation. While triremes were the rock stars of the Athenian fleet, the real magic lay in the technological advancements that kept these vessels ahead of their time. Forget CGI and special effects. These ships were the real blockbusters of their era, and they had the hardware to prove it. Now, before you start imagining ancient shipwrights as bearded hipsters with bespoke tools, let's set the record straight. These guys were more like the Silicon Valley tech wizards of their day, constantly innovating to stay ahead of the competition. The ancient Greek shipbuilding industry was a hotbed of creativity, driven by the demands of warfare and the promise of lucrative trade. First up, let's talk about hull design. Greek shipbuilders were the first to construct vessels with a full keel, a game-changer in naval architecture. This wasn't just a plank slacked onto the bottom of a boat. It was a structural spine that provided stability and allowed for faster, more agile movement through the water. Think of it like adding a spoiler to a race car. Suddenly, your trireme could corner like it was on rails. And speaking of speed, let's not forget the oars. The trireme's triple-tiered arrangement of rowers known as the thranites, zygites, and thalamites was a stroke of genius, literally and figuratively. This design maximized human power, transforming muscle into momentum. A well-coordinated crew could propel a trireme at speeds of up to 9 knots. That's faster than you can say enemy overboard. But with great power comes great responsibility, and the Greeks were nothing if not resourceful. Enter the hypsometer, the ship's equivalent of a superhero's utility belt. These were thick cables, usually made of hemp, running the length of the hull to counteract the tremendous forces exerted by the rowers. Without them, a trireme might flex and break like a cheap plastic toy in a toddler's hands. Not exactly ideal when you're in the heat of battle. Of course, these technological marvels didn't come cheap. Constructing a single trireme could cost as much as 40 talents. Imagine a stack of silver weighing as much as a couple of linebackers. Maintaining the fleet was a financial juggernaut, but the Greeks knew it was money well spent. A well-equipped navy was like having a personal insurance policy in a world where the geopolitical climate could shift faster than the Aegean winds. Let's not overlook the navigational prowess that kept Greek sailors on course. Ancient mariners relied on celestial navigation, using the stars as their guide long before GPS was even a gleam in an engineer's eye. The Greeks possessed an uncanny ability to read the skies, a skill that was as valuable as any weapon. Without these celestial road maps, the entire concept of a Mediterranean empire would have been as plausible as a ship made of cheese. And while we're on the topic of navigation, let's address the romantic notion of daring Greek explorers charting unknown seas. Sure, the Greeks were adventurous, but they weren't just setting sail on whims and prayers. Trade was the engine driving their voyages, and those ships weren't just filled with adventurers. They were packed with goods: olive oil, wine, grain, pottery. These were the commodities that filled the holds of Greek merchant ships, turning them into floating marketplaces. The impact of these advancements wasn't confined to the battlefield. Greek trade networks sprawled across the known world, from the shores of the Black Sea to the bustling markets of Egypt. The Greek knack for shipbuilding and navigation turned the Mediterranean into a maritime superhighway, with Athens as its toll booth operator. This wasn't just about economic gain, it was about cultural exchange, as ideas, art and technology flowed along with goods. But let's not get too carried away with the romance of it all. The life of a Greek sailor wasn't all sunsets and sea breezes. It was a tough gig, marked by long, grueling voyages and the constant threat of piracy or storms. The sea was a harsh mistress, and those who dared to navigate her depths needed the courage of a lion and the patience of a saint. And lest we forget, ancient shipbuilding wasn't all smooth sailing. The challenges faced by shipwrights were as numerous as the barnacles on a neglected hull. Primary sources like the writings of Thucydides and Herodotus offer glimpses into the ingenuity required to overcome them. Building a trireme required a deep understanding of geometry and physics, not to mention a steady hand with saws and chisels. It was a delicate dance of balancing weight and buoyancy, strength and flexibility. As we navigate further into this saga, it's clear that Greek naval tactics weren't just about muscle and might, they were about brains too. The innovations in shipbuilding and navigation were key to maintaining Greek supremacy at sea, ensuring that their oarsmen weren't just rowing in circles, but steering the course of history. So, as we sail toward the next chapter of this epic tale, remember, every trireme that cut through the waves was a testament to human ingenuity and determination. The Greeks may have sailed for glory, but they also sailed for survival, and their legacy is as enduring as the sea itself. Stay tuned, because the waters of history are vast, and we've only just begun our voyage. As we steer our narrative into the decline of Greek naval dominance, it's time to trade our rose-tinted glasses for something a little sharper. The glory days of Greek naval supremacy weren't destined to last forever. After all, every wave eventually finds its beach. The Athenians, those maritime maestros, found themselves facing a storm of economic and strategic shifts that would make even the most seasoned sailor seasick. Let's start with the economic elephant in the room. Remember those triremes? The Ferraris of the ancient world? Well, it turns out maintaining a fleet of high-performance ships is about as cheap as a weekend in Mykonos with a platinum card. The constant need for repairs, upgrades, and, let's not forget, the salaries for those 170 rowers per ship was a financial drain that could sink even the most buoyant coffers. At the height of its power, the Athenian navy boasted around 300 triremes, which meant Athens was hemorrhaging resources faster than a leaky cask of wine at a Dionysian festival. This brings us to the economic strain that began to gnaw at Athens like a relentless woodworm. The Delian League, originally a mutual defence pact, had morphed into an Athenian empire in all but name. Tribute flowed in from allied city-states, like a never-ending stream of silver, but maintaining such hegemony was costly. When the Peloponnesian War rolled around and dragged on like an ancient soap opera with no end in sight, the financial burden became unsustainable. The once mighty flow of tribute dried up, leaving Athens with a fiscal hangover that no amount of fiscal policy could cure. But economic woes weren't the only factor at play. The very strategy that had propelled Athens to its naval zenith was also its Achilles' heel. While the trireme was a revolutionary piece of maritime engineering, it was designed for short, sharp engagements, not protracted sieges or sustained blockades. The Peloponnesian War exposed these limitations like a harsh Aegean sun on a pale skin. The drawn-out conflict strained Athenian resources and highlighted the need for a more versatile military approach. Enter the Spartan navy. Yes, you heard that right. The land-loving Spartans, historically as attached to their phalanxes as a toddler to their blankie, decided they could play the naval game too, with funding from Persia, because why not? Sparta built a fleet that could challenge Athens' supremacy at sea. This strategic pivot was like watching a basketball team suddenly dominate a chess tournament, unexpected and game-changing. The Battle of Aegospotami in 405 BCE was the final nail in the coffin for Athenian naval dominance. Sparta, wielding its new maritime power, annihilated the Athenian fleet, effectively ending the war and turning Athens into a shadow of its former self. What we see here is a classic tale of overreach meeting reality, where the very tools of Athenian power, its ships and its strategy, became its undoing. The shift in military tactics and the economic strain were a 1-2 punch that Athens couldn't dodge. Yet, even as their physical dominance waned, the Greeks left an indelible mark on naval warfare, one that echoes through the corridors of time. Fast forward to the modern era, and you'll find Greek naval tactics still lurking in the tactical playbooks of navies worldwide. The use of maneuverability and precision over sheer numbers, a lesson from Salamis, continues to inform naval doctrine. The idea that a smaller, more agile force can outwit a larger, lumbering opponent is as relevant today as it was in the cramped straits of Salamis. Just ask any naval strategist worth their salt, and they'll tell you the Greeks wrote the book, and we're still reading it. We've also inherited the democratic ideals that were, in part, forged in the crucible of naval warfare. The notion that ordinary citizens, like those tireless rowers, could wield power and influence has become a cornerstone of Western political thought. The Athenian experiment in democracy, with all its flaws and foibles, laid the groundwork for the modern systems we navigate today. It's a legacy that's as intricate as it is enduring, a testament to the resilience of ideas even when the ships they sailed on have long since sunk. Now, let's not romanticize the past without acknowledging the rough seas. The myths of noble democracy and invincible fleets are as seductive as a siren song, but the reality was messier, grittier, more human. The Greeks were innovators, yes, but they were also opportunists, politicians, and, let's face it, fallible beings capable of monumental blunders. Their story is a reminder that history isn't a straight line of progress, but a tangled web of ambition, conflict, and the occasional stroke of genius. So as we lower the sails on this journey through Greek naval history, remember the dualities we've uncovered, the legend and the truth, the glory and the grime. The Greeks may have been masters of the sea, but they were equally adept at navigating the complexities of the human condition. Their legacy sails on, charting courses through the vast ocean of history, reminding us that the past is always just beneath the surface, waiting to be rediscovered. As we part ways with the ancient world, let's carry forward the lessons of the Greeks, of innovation, adaptability, and the relentless pursuit of knowledge. Because if there's one thing history has taught us, it's that the tides will keep turning, and those who dare to navigate them will continue to shape the world. And maybe, just maybe, we'll find that the echoes of those ancient oarsmen still resonate today, propelling us forward into uncharted waters. In the bustling bazaars of history, where ideas traded places faster than a merchant peddling spices, the Upanishads emerged like philosophical rock stars on a quest for meaning. Picture this. It's around 800 BCE, and the Indian subcontinent is buzzing with change. Society isn't just stretching its legs, it's doing a full-on yoga pose, reaching for the cosmic truths while balancing on the uncertainties of the day. Now, before we dive headlong into these ancient texts, let's set the scene. The Vedic period is coming to a close, and the religious landscape is shifting like sand in a desert storm. The Vedas, those revered texts that laid down the beats of ritual and sacrifice, are still spinning on the cosmic turntable. But there's a new sound in town, a deeper, more introspective vibe that's questioning everything from the nature of reality to the meaning of existence. Enter the Upanishads, the spiritual equivalent of a TED Talk, but with fewer PowerPoints and more pondering. The Upanishads popped up between 800 and 200 BCE, a time when society was experiencing the kind of upheaval that makes a midlife crisis look like a casual Tuesday. The old ways of the Vedic rituals, think elaborate sacrifices and offerings that could make a barbecue festival look modest, were being scrutinized. This was a period of transformation, where the spiritual focus shifted from external rites to internal enlightenment. It was like moving from a blockbuster movie to an indie film, less about the special effects, more about the storyline. So, what's the big deal with these texts? Well, the Upanishads didn't just dip a toe into the philosophical pool. They dove in head first, asking questions like, who am I, and what is the nature of reality? Spoiler alert, the answer isn't 42, but the journey getting there is worth every philosophical detour. They introduce concepts like karma, the cosmic cause and effect loop, dharma, the righteous path you're supposed to follow without a GPS, and moksha, the ultimate liberation from the cycle of birth and rebirth. A spiritual mic drop, if you will. But let's not get too misty-eyed with romantic notions. This was no utopian quest. The Upanishads were born in a world where power dynamics were as complex as a Bollywood plot. The societal structure was as rigid as a British butler, with a caste system that made sure everyone knew their place. Yet, amidst this hierarchy, there was a burgeoning intellectual class eager to challenge the dogma and delve into deeper truths. The sages and scholars who penned these texts weren't exactly lounging in ivory towers. They were part of a vibrant discourse, where ideas clashed and converged in hermitages and forests, the ancient equivalent of a think tank, but with fewer whiteboards and more banyan trees. They questioned the status quo, probing into the limits of human understanding and the very essence of the self. Diving into the Upanishads is like opening a cosmic can of worms with layers of meaning that philosophers have been peeling back for centuries. Take, for instance, the Chandogya Upanishad, which spins tales about the interconnectedness of all things, a concept that wouldn't be out of place in a modern mindfulness retreat, or the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, which explores the nature of reality in a way that makes The Matrix look like a beginner's guide. Yet, these texts didn't just float in the ether of abstract thought. They had practical implications, challenging the ritualistic status quo and offering new paths to spiritual fulfillment. It was a time when the intellectual elite began to question the necessity of elaborate sacrifices, suggesting that true enlightenment was a personal journey rather than a public spectacle. If you're wondering why this matters, think of the Upanishads as the philosophical foundation stones for later Indian spiritual developments like Buddhism and Jainism. They sowed the seeds of inquiry and introspection that would grow into towering spiritual philosophies, influencing thinkers across the ages. The Upanishads weren't just ancient musings. They were the sparks that lit the fire of introspective thought, a blaze that would illuminate the path for countless seekers in the centuries to come. In the grand scheme of things, the Upanishads serve as a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge is not about finding definitive answers, but about embracing the questions. They teach us that enlightenment is less about the destination and more about the journey itself, a truth as relevant today as it was over 2 millennia ago. So, while the world around them was shifting like tectonic plates, the sages of the Upanishads were busy crafting a legacy of wisdom, one that continues to resonate in the corridors of time. Now, let's shift gears from the lofty realms of philosophical musings to the nitty-gritty of ancient economics. Imagine a world where pastoral life is slowly giving way to an agrarian society, a seismic shift akin to swapping flip phones for smartphones. The rolling pastures, once dotted with cattle and wandering herdsmen, gradually transformed into fields of wheat and rice. This was no mere change of scenery, it was a revolution that turned the societal cogwheels in new directions. As the ploughs dug deeper into the earth, the very fabric of society began to alter. The pastoral economy, reliant on livestock and nomadic tendencies, slowly yielded to the plough's relentless march. This agrarian shift wasn't just about tilling soil, it was about planting seeds of change in the social structure. With agriculture providing a more stable food supply, people started settling down, villages popped up like mushrooms after rain, and community life thrived in new ways. This economic shift brought about a new player on the scene, the merchant class. These savvy traders were the original hustlers, navigating the bustling bazaars and trade routes that crisscrossed the subcontinent. They carried spices, textiles, and a hefty dose of existential dread. Yes, the merchant class, with their growing influence and wealth, found themselves pondering life's big questions, questions that the old Vedic rituals didn't quite answer. It's a tale as old as time. When your bank balance grows, so do your existential crises. These merchants, with their silk robes and philosophical quandaries, began to question the status quo. The Vedic rituals, which once seemed like the ultimate cosmic insurance policy, started looking like an outdated subscription service. Expensive, cumbersome, and a bit of a hassle. Picture this. A grand ritual could involve sacrificing hundreds of animals. We're talking major livestock losses here, not just a couple of sacrificial goats. It was a spectacle worthy of a Game of Thrones episode, but not exactly sustainable or economically savvy for those with a keen eye on their bottom line. The practicality of these rituals was increasingly scrutinized. The cost wasn't just in animals, but in the time and resources needed to appease the deities. Rituals could drag on for days, requiring a small army of priests who knew their way around a sacred chant. For a merchant counting his silver, this was not the most appealing way to spend resources. Enter the Upanishads, with their promise of inner peace and enlightenment without the need for extravagant displays of devotion. Suddenly, introspection was the new black, and the merchants were all in. But let's not pretend this was some sort of spiritual utopia. The Vedic sacrifices had their allure. There's a certain drama to grand gestures that an internal quest just can't match. The fire of a sacrificial pyre, the resonance of mantras echoing through the air, and the palpable sense of community were intoxicating in their own right. Yet, as the economy transitioned and personal wealth became a more prominent player, the Upanishads offered a streamlined path to spiritual fulfillment, no animals required. This economic backdrop is crucial, for it laid the groundwork for the intellectual ferment that birthed the Upanishads. In a world where wealth distribution was changing, so too were the avenues for spiritual exploration. The merchant class, with its newfound influence, wasn't just content with changing economic structures. They were ready to challenge the spiritual and philosophical ones too. The rise of this class also altered the power dynamics within society. While the Brahmins, those ritual-loving priests, still held sway, their monopoly on spirituality was being questioned. The merchant class brought a democratizing influence, opening up spiritual discourse to a wider audience. The Upanishads became a vehicle for this change, offering a more personal, introspective path that appealed to those who were tired of the elaborate theatrics of Vedic rituals. In a way, the Upanishads were like the indie films of spiritual texts, low on budget but high on impact. They cut through the pomp and circumstance, offering philosophical depth without the need for grandiose displays. This shift towards personal enlightenment over public ritual marked a significant transformation in the spiritual landscape, one that would resonate through the ages. So, as the ploughs tilled the fields and merchants plied their trade, the very soul of society was being reworked. This was a time when the quest for meaning wasn't just a philosophical pursuit, but an economic necessity. The Upanishads, with their introspective allure and philosophical depth, provided the perfect counterpoint to a world in flux, offering solace to a class in the throes of existential inquiry. And thus, the stage was set for a new era of spiritual exploration, one that would continue to evolve as society marched forward into the tapestry of history. As the stage was set for a new era of spiritual exploration, the spotlight swung to the political theatre, where kings and sages were busy rehearsing their roles as both allies and adversaries. In the grand narrative of ancient India, the Upanishads didn't just whisper sweet cosmic nothings into the ears of seekers, they played a starring role in the power dynamics of the day. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of a game of chess, where every philosophical move had the potential to topple a king, or at least make him question his divine right to rule. Now let's dive into the dizzying dance of politics and philosophy, where rulers and thinkers were the original frenemies. Picture this: a king sitting on his throne, draped in silk and gold, while a sage sits cross-legged nearby, seemingly indifferent to the opulence around him. The king, with all his power and riches, knows that his authority is only as secure as the beliefs of his subjects. Enter the Upanishads, stage left, with their tantalizing promise of inner enlightenment and their none-too-subtle critique of worldly power. In a world where the divine right of kings was the gold standard of legitimacy, the Upanishads pose some awkward questions. They challenged the very notion of divine right by suggesting that true authority came from understanding the self and the universe, not from some celestial stamp of approval. This was a philosophical grenade tossed into the lap of rulers who'd rather not question the cosmic source of their crown. But before you picture these texts as mere troublemakers, let's consider how rulers used them to their advantage. The Upanishads, with their esoteric wisdom, were also a handy tool for some enlightened kings to legitimize their rule. By positioning themselves as philosopher kings, rulers could claim a deeper understanding of the cosmic order, aligning their reign with the eternal truths of the universe. It was the ultimate power move, rebranding a throne as a seat of wisdom rather than just a cushy chair with a nice view. However, this wasn't a one-size-fits-all strategy. While some kings embraced the Upanishadic wisdom to bolster their image, others found themselves in a bit of a philosophical pickle. The texts questioned the very fabric of social hierarchy, suggesting that everyone, from the lowliest peasant to the highest ruler, had the potential to achieve enlightenment. Talk about a democratic bombshell in a society that thrived on a rigid caste system. The story of King Janaka of Videha provides a fascinating case study. Known for his patronage of scholars and sages, Janaka was a ruler who managed to walk the tightrope between power and philosophy with remarkable finesse. He hosted debates and discussions in his court, where sages like Yajnavalkya would challenge the status quo, turning the royal hall into an ancient TEDx conference, minus the lanyards. By engaging with these thinkers, Janaka not only legitimized his rule, but also earned a reputation as a wise and just leader. He was the philosopher king prototype, long before Marcus Aurelius made it cool in the West. Yet, not every ruler was as astute. Some found the Upanishadic teachings a little too close for comfort. The idea that true knowledge and power resided within the self rather than in external symbols of authority, was a direct challenge to their rule. This wasn't just philosophical banter, it was a threat to the very structure that propped up their thrones. The Upanishads, with their subversive undertones, were the Socratic gadflies to the horses of state, provoking rulers to question their own legitimacy. Let's not forget the economic angle in this heady mix of philosophy and politics. The patronage of sages and scholars wasn't just a matter of intellectual curiosity or spiritual aspiration, it was also a strategic investment. Kings who supported these thinkers could attract the intellectual elite to their courts, turning them into vibrant centers of learning and debate. This, in turn, enhanced the cultural prestige of their kingdoms, drawing merchants, artists, and other influential figures like moths to a philosophical flame. As the political intrigue thickens, it's important to remember that the Upanishads weren't just passive scrolls on a dusty shelf. They were active participants in the socio-political drama, shaping and reshaping the landscape of power. The sages who penned these texts weren't isolated hermits, they were deeply embedded in the societal fabric, engaging with kings and commoners alike, challenging the norms and inviting humanity to look beyond the visible. But let's not romanticize the past as a golden age of enlightened dialogue. The reality was far messier, with power plays and philosophical duels that would make a modern political thriller seem tame. The Upanishads were both a challenge to and an instrument of ruling powers, serving as a philosophical mirror reflecting both the ideals and the flaws of the age. In this delicate dance of power, the sages wielded their words like swords, cutting through the illusions of authority and urging rulers to seek a deeper wisdom. The kings, in turn, navigated this intellectual terrain with a mix of curiosity and caution, aware that the very text that could legitimize their rule could also undermine it. It was a high-stakes game of philosophical poker, where the chips were not just crowns and kingdoms, but the very soul of the society. So, as we continue our journey through the political labyrinth of ancient India, let's keep our eyes on the interplay between power and philosophy. The Upanishads were not just ancient musings, they were catalysts of change, challenging the status quo and offering new visions of leadership and authority. In a world where the divine right of kings was being scrutinized, these texts dared to ask the ultimate question, what does it mean to truly rule? And in doing so, they set the stage for a new kind of kingship, one that resonated with the timeless truths of the universe. As we leave this chapter open-ended, remember that the story of the Upanishads is far from over. The philosophical ripples they set in motion continue to influence the corridors of power, both ancient and modern. The dance between kings and sages, between authority and enlightenment, is an eternal one, a testament to the enduring quest for wisdom in a world ever hungry for meaning. So stay tuned as we delve deeper into the labyrinth of history, uncovering the layers of intrigue that continue to shape the tapestry of human thought. As we peel back yet another layer of this ancient onion, it's time to take a closer look at the societal stage where the Upanishads played their part. Picture a society with a caste system as rigid as a Victorian corset, yet with philosophical whispers suggesting that liberation is just a breath away. It's like trying to sell ice in Antarctica, a tough pitch, but intriguing nonetheless. The Upanishads, those ancient musings that dared to ask the big questions, found themselves in a world preoccupied with staying in its lane, or caste to be precise. The caste system wasn't just a social construct, it was the ancient version of a social media algorithm, deciding who saw what, where they went, and what doors remained firmly shut. At the top of this hierarchical heap sat the Brahmins, the priestly class who had a monopoly on spiritual knowledge and ritual practices. They lived in the penthouses of ancient Indian society, their spiritual stock portfolios diversified with mantras and rituals. Below them were the Kshatriyas, the warrior class, tasked with protecting the realm and occasionally engaging in philosophical banter with sages, as we saw with King Janaka. These were the folks who might be seen as the action heroes in this ancient drama, although their brawn was often accompanied by a surprising amount of brain. The Vaishyas, the merchant class, were the economic engines, driving trade and commerce with the finesse of a Wall Street trader eyeing the next big deal. And then came the Shudras, tasked with serving the other three classes, their roles as fixed as the stars in a pre-Galileo universe. Now, the Upanishads had this delightful tendency to throw philosophical curveballs. They whispered of an inner self, or Atman, that transcended worldly identities, a spiritual wildcard that could trump even the strictest social order. Imagine the philosophical equivalent of an all-access pass, one that wasn't tied to your caste, creed, or the number of cows in your backyard. But hold your horses, or chariots, before you imagine a utopia of egalitarian bliss. Despite the radical potential of their teachings, the Upanishads didn't exactly dismantle the social hierarchy overnight. They operated more like a gentle tug on the strings of a tightly bound society, suggesting rather than insisting, nudging rather than shoving. Take gender roles, for instance. The Upanishads were penned in a time when women were largely seen as adjuncts to their male counterparts, their roles defined by domestic duties and societal expectations. Yet, within these texts, there were glimmers of progressive thought, like the tale of Gargi Vachaknavi, a woman sage who debated with the best of them in King Janaka's court. Gargi wasn't just a footnote, she was a full chapter in the story of philosophical inquiry, proving that intellectual prowess wasn't limited to the bearded sages of the age. However, let's not get carried away by the romance of an ancient feminist icon. Gargi was the exception, not the rule. Her presence in the Upanishads is a reminder that while the texts opened the door to philosophical exploration, they didn't exactly smash the patriarchy. The average woman was still expected to play by the societal playbook, which was about as diverse as a monastic vow of silence. Economic factors also played a significant role in shaping these social dynamics. As trade routes expanded and the merchant class gained influence, there was a subtle shift in the economic underpinnings of society. With wealth came power, and with power came the ability to challenge the status quo. The Upanishads found fertile ground among the merchant class, who were increasingly questioning not just their place in the world, but the very nature of existence itself. It was as if the more they accumulated, the more they pondered whether there was more to life than silk and spices. The interplay between economic status and spiritual pursuit created a fascinating paradox. The very texts that suggested a path to liberation were often discussed in settings where access was determined by wealth and status. Spiritual teachings were a bit like luxury goods, available to those who could afford the time and resources to pursue them. The Upanishads might have preached inner enlightenment, but it often came with a cover charge. And then there's the myth of ancient Indian spirituality as a bastion of egalitarian ideals, a notion as appealing as it is misleading. The reality was more nuanced. The Upanishads did indeed question the rigidity of societal structures, but they didn't necessarily advocate for dismantling them. Instead, they offered a philosophical escape hatch, a way to transcend worldly limits without necessarily changing the world itself. In a society where the layers of caste and gender were as thick as the dust on an ancient manuscript, the Upanishads were both a product and a critique of their time. They reflected the complexities and contradictions of a world in flux, a society grappling with profound questions of identity and meaning while firmly rooted in tradition. As we continue our journey through this philosophical landscape, let's remember that the Upanishads were as much about challenging the mind as they were about navigating the social maze of their era. They offered a glimpse beyond the veil of societal norms, inviting seekers to look within while still acknowledging the world around them. So, as we leave this chapter hanging like a question mark in the air, remember that the Upanishads were not just ancient musings on the nature of reality, they were an invitation to question, to explore, and to transcend. They dared to ask the big questions in a world that often preferred simple answers, setting the stage for a continuous dialogue between the self and society, between the known and the unknown. Get ready, because there's still more to unravel as we plunge deeper into this historical saga, examining the echoes of these ancient texts in the corridors of time. As we leave the Upanishads suspended like a philosophical piñata, their legacy continues to spill out across time, influencing spiritual movements from the banks of the Ganges to the bookstores of the New Age section. These ancient musings managed to spark revolutions in thought that spanned continents and centuries, proving that truly great ideas have a half-life that rivals uranium. First up, let's talk Buddhism and Jainism, the spiritual offspring that took the Upanishadic torch and ran with it faster than a monk chasing enlightenment. The Buddha, that serene figure who sat under a tree until he cracked the code of suffering, was born into the same cultural milieu that birthed the Upanishads. Siddhartha Gautama, before he became the Buddha, was no stranger to the philosophical currents of his time. In fact, the concepts of karma and samsara, the cycle of birth and rebirth, were so ingrained in the spiritual air that he breathed it was like philosophical oxygen. The Buddha, in his quest for truth, took a scalpel to the Upanishadic ideas, dissecting and reassembling them into his Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. He wasn't about to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but he did question the necessity of the metaphysical gymnastics sometimes found in the Upanishadic texts. His focus was laser-sharp, in suffering by understanding it, rather than getting lost in cosmic speculation. Buddhism became a lean, mean enlightenment machine, cutting through the layers of ritual and hierarchy like a Zen garden through a jungle. Jainism, with its emphasis on non-violence and asceticism, also drew from the deep well of Upanishadic wisdom. Mahavira, the last Tirthankara, and a contemporary of the Buddha, took the idea of self-discipline to Olympic levels, advocating for a life of extreme austerity to break free from karmic bondage. The Upanishadic notion of liberation, or moksha, was the golden ticket for Jain practitioners, offering a way out of the cycle of birth and rebirth through rigorous self-control and an unyielding commitment to non-violence. In Jainism, the idea of ahimsa, or non-harm, became the guiding star, illuminating a path of ethical living that resonates even today. Fast forward a few centuries, and a hop, skip, and a jump across the globe, and we find the Upanishads whispering sweet nothings into the ears of Western philosophers. When the texts were first translated into Persian, and later into Latin, they caught the eye of European intellectuals who were hungry for new ideas. The German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, for instance, found in the Upanishads a kindred spirit, praising them as the production of the highest human wisdom. He wasn't alone. These texts found their way into the libraries of thinkers who were tired of the same old metaphysical soup and craved something with a bit more spice. By the 19th century, the Upanishads had become the spiritual equivalent of a cross-continental influencer, shaping the thoughts of poets and philosophers alike. Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, those champions of the transcendentalist movement, were enamored with the idea of the oversoul and the interconnectedness of all things, concepts that echoed the Upanishadic teachings like a mantra in the woods. But let's not get too misty-eyed about the enlightenment of the West. The romanticization of Eastern philosophies often glossed over the complexities and contradictions inherent in the texts. While the Upanishads offered profound insights into the nature of the self and the universe, they were also products of their time, deeply entwined with the social and political realities of ancient India. The Western embrace of these texts sometimes veered into the realm of exoticism, a spiritual tourism that overlooked the gritty details in favor of a curated experience. Now, let's zoom into the 20th century, where the Upanishads found themselves amidst the New Age movement, a smorgasbord of spirituality that borrowed liberally from ancient teachings. The idea of self-realization, central to the Upanishads, became a buzzword in workshops and retreats, hawked alongside crystals and chakra alignments. Self-help gurus and spiritual leaders adapted these ancient ideas to fit modern lifestyles, offering enlightenment as a weekend package deal. The Upanishads, with their timeless wisdom, were rebranded for the hyper-connected world, promising inner peace in an era of Instagram anxiety. Yet, it's worth remembering that the allure of the Upanishads lies not just in their philosophical depth, but in their ability to speak to the human condition. They tackle the big questions that remain as pressing today as they were millennia ago. Who are we? Why are we here? What's the point of it all? These texts invite us to look beyond the surface, to dive into the depths of our own consciousness, and to seek the answers within. In this quest for meaning, the Upanishads remain a beacon, their light undimmed by the passage of time. They remind us that while the world may change, empires rise and fall, technologies evolve, societies transform, the search for truth is a constant and eternal journey that transcends the boundaries of time and space. So, as we wrap up this whirlwind tour through the legacy of the Upanishads, let's take a moment to appreciate their enduring relevance. In a world that often feels as chaotic as a cosmic dance, these ancient texts offer a moment of stillness, a chance to pause and reflect on the bigger picture. They challenge us to look beyond the immediate and the mundane, to seek a deeper understanding of ourselves and our place in the universe. The Upanishads, with their profound insights and timeless wisdom, continue to inspire seekers across the globe. They are a testament to the enduring power of ideas, a reminder that even in the face of uncertainty and change, the quest for knowledge and enlightenment remains at the heart of the human experience. And so, dear listener, as we close this chapter on the Upanishads, let us carry their legacy forward, embracing the questions they pose and the mysteries they unravel. For in the end, it is not the answers that define us, but the journey we undertake in search of them. In a world where a poor haircut might just change the course of history, Louis Pasteur stands as a testament to the fact that not all great minds start off with a stellar education. Born in Dole, France, on December 27, 1822, Pasteur was the product of a time when science was less about safety goggles and more about wild guesswork. Now, Dole wasn't exactly the birthplace of legends, more like a sleepy town content with making cheese and wine. But, as fate would have it, it was also the cradle for one of the most revolutionary scientists of the 19th century. Young Louis wasn't exactly the wonderkind his parents might have hoped for. His early academic career was more of a stumble than a sprint. In fact, he was about as interested in school as a cat is in a bath. His grades? Let's just say they wouldn't have made the fridge. Louis was more inclined towards fishing and sketching portraits, activities that were hardly going to win him a Nobel Prize. But every journey begins with a single step, or in Pasteur's case, a less than impressive report card. Now, let's talk about that infamous haircut. Legend has it that young Louis once got a trim that was so terrible, even his own mother had to stifle a laugh. This may sound trivial, but in the grand theatre of history, small events can lead to big changes. Perhaps it was this haircut that nudged him away from his artistic pursuits, steering him instead towards the sciences, a field where bad hair days are the least of your worries. Despite his academic hiccups, Pasteur managed to enroll at the Collège Royal de Besançon. It wasn't exactly the Ivy League, but it was a start. His time there was marked by more struggles than triumphs, and he ended up with a Bachelor of Arts degree, hardly the stuff of scientific legends. But Pasteur wasn't one to give up easily. In 1843, against all odds and likely a few eye-rolls from skeptics, he was admitted to the prestigious École Normale Supérieure in Paris. This was where Pasteur's story really began to take shape, much like a loaf of bread slowly rising in the oven. Pasteur's tenure at the École Normale was a mixed bag. He was more focused now, but still not exactly setting the academic world on fire. Enter crystallography, the study of crystal structures and properties, a field that sounds dry enough to put an insomniac to sleep, but would soon become Pasteur's playground. It was like stumbling upon a hidden portal to a world where he could finally shine. And shine he did. In 1848, Pasteur made a groundbreaking discovery that would put him on the scientific map. While examining tartaric acid crystals, the kind found in the dregs of wine barrels, he observed something peculiar. The crystals were asymmetrical, displaying a characteristic known as chirality. This was no small potatoes. Pasteur was essentially the first to show that molecules could exist in mirror image forms. Think of it as the molecular version of left and right hands. This discovery was far more than a neat party trick. It was a revelation that would ripple through the fields of chemistry and biology. In the world of science, this finding was akin to finding a 100 bill in an old coat pocket. Let's not forget the context here. 1848 was a year of revolutions across Europe. While others were busy toppling governments, Pasteur was quietly toppling scientific paradigms. His discovery of molecular chirality was a game-changer. It was like being the first kid on the block to own a smartphone. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know what he was up to. But why did this matter? Well, chirality has everything to do with the molecules that make up life itself. Pasteur's work laid the groundwork for understanding how these molecules behave, which would eventually lead to advances in pharmaceuticals, food production, and even our understanding of DNA. Imagine all this from a guy who couldn't score a decent haircut or a straight-A report card. Pasteur's journey from a struggling student to a pioneering scientist is proof positive that the path to greatness is rarely a straight line. It's more like a winding road filled with unexpected turns and the occasional pit stop for personal grooming. His early work in crystallography wasn't just a stepping stone, it was a leap forward that would propel him into future discoveries. And while his early days might have lacked the glamour of later achievements, they were crucial in shaping the mind that would eventually revolutionize science itself. So, there you have it, the humble beginnings of Louis Pasteur, a man who, despite a rocky start and a few bad hair days, would go on to change the world. His early life is a reminder that greatness often sprouts from the most unlikely of places, and sometimes all it takes is a leap of faith and perhaps a better barber. From the humble beginnings of a young man who struggled more with school than a cat with a Rubik's Cube, Louis Pasteur went on to enter the riotous world of fermentation, a realm where sugar and yeast danced together to make the magic potion we call alcohol. In the mid-19th century, Pasteur's curiosity about this bubbling brew was piqued not by a desire to revolutionize science, but rather to solve a very earthly problem. The French wine industry was in a bit of a pickle, or perhaps a bad batch of grape juice. Let's talk about spontaneous generation. No, it's not the latest band sweeping the charts, but rather a once popular scientific theory suggesting that life could arise from non-living matter. Picture this. People genuinely believed maggots could spontaneously appear in meat, like some kind of horrific magic trick. This idea was about as credible as finding Bigfoot at your local Starbucks. Pasteur, with his penchant for poking holes in accepted truths, was not buying it. He knew that life, even at its smallest, was not about to pop into existence out of thin air, or sugar water for that matter. Now, Pasteur's adventures in fermentation began around 1857, when he was asked to investigate why some batches of alcohol were turning sour faster than a toddler denied a cookie. The stakes were high. The French economy practically floated on wine, and a dip in quality was like trying to sell a soggy baguette. Unthinkable. Under the microscope, Pasteur saw that yeast was not just a passive ingredient, but a living organism, a revelation that rocked the scientific world. Yeast, those tiny fungi, were the real MVPs of fermentation, converting sugars into alcohol and carbon dioxide. This wasn't just a party trick. It was a groundbreaking discovery that showed fermentation was a biological process, not a chemical one. But Pasteur wasn't done shaking things up. He noticed that when fermentation went awry, it was due to the presence of unwanted microorganisms, tiny party crashers ruining the fun for everyone else. This observation laid the groundwork for debunking spontaneous generation once and for all. In 1859, Pasteur conducted his famous swan neck flask experiment. He filled flasks with a nutrient-rich broth, boiled them to kill any existing microbes, and left them open to air, but with a twist. The necks were curved like a swan's, trapping airborne particles. The broth remained clear, proving that without contaminating particles, no life appeared. Voila! Spontaneous generation was as dead as a doornail. Meanwhile, back in the vineyards, the French wine industry was crying into its barrels over a different nuisance, spoilage. Wine was turning into vinegar faster than you could say sacré bleu. Enter Pasteur, the man with a plan and a palate that was more accustomed to solutions than sipping. The guy wasn't exactly a connoisseur. Legend has it he'd have trouble distinguishing a Bordeaux from a Burgundy, but that didn't stop him from saving the day. With his newfound understanding of microorganisms, Pasteur developed a method to heat wine to a temperature that would kill the spoilage, causing bacteria without affecting the taste. This technique, dubbed pasteurization, was a game-changer. Now, don't picture Pasteur as some lab-coated hero basking in the glow of his achievements. His journey was riddled with skepticism, not to mention a few raised eyebrows from the scientific community. You see, traditionalists loved their theories like a grandmother loves her old recipes, and they weren't too keen on tossing them out for something as untested as pasteurization. But the proof, as they say, was in the pudding, or in this case, the wine. By the 1860s, Pasteur had practically become the guardian angel of French viniculture, rescuing the industry from potential ruin. Economically, this was huge. Wine was not just a drink. It was liquid gold for France, representing a significant portion of their exports. Pasteur's work helped stabilize the industry at a time when France needed it most, especially given the political upheavals and economic pressures of the era. It was like putting a cork in a leaky barrel, a simple solution with massive implications. And here's where we sprinkle a little humor. Imagine Pasteur at a wine-tasting event, swirling his glass with the precision of a scientist, not a sommelier. His palate was more tuned to the intricacies of microbial life than the subtleties of tannins. The man could spot a road bacterium at 100 paces, but might not distinguish a hint of oak in his Merlot. No matter. His contributions to the wine industry were as rich and full-bodied as the finest Cabernet. Pasteur's discoveries in fermentation didn't just stop at wine. His insights had far-reaching implications, altering the way we understood diseases and even leading to the development of vaccines. But for now, let's toast to his ability to see what others overlooked, to his knack for questioning the unquestionable, and to his role in turning the tide for French wine. The rest of Pasteur's story is still fermenting, waiting to be uncorked in the chapters ahead. So, stay tuned as we delve further into the life of a man who, despite his humble beginnings and questionable taste in haircuts, reshaped the scientific world with the clarity of a perfectly aged Chardonnay. And just when you thought Louis Pasteur might kick back with a glass of his newly safeguarded wine, along came a crisis of a different fabric, literally. The year was 1865, and the French silk industry was unravelling faster than a cheap sweater in a washing machine. Enter the silkworm plague, a microscopic soap opera starring our favourite scientist. France, known for its luxurious silk, was in turmoil as its precious silkworms were dropping dead like flies. The stakes? A whopping 130 million francs annually, roughly the GDP of a small country back then. Silk was to France what espresso is to Italy, essential, lucrative, and culturally intertwined. So, what was the deal with these silkworms? They were suffering from a disease known as pebrine, which sounds as charming as stepping on a Lego barefoot. This disease was decimating the silk industry, and France was losing its metaphorical shirt. The government was desperate, and when governments get desperate, they call in the big guns, or in this case, the big brains. Enter Pasteur, a man who could solve a crisis faster than you could say cocoon. But before we dive into Pasteur's silk spin-off, let's set the scene. The silk industry in France was not just about fancy dresses and delicate scarves. It was a cornerstone of the economy, employing over 100,000 people. Imagine the panic when silk production plummeted like a lead balloon. The French government needed a saviour, and Pasteur, with his knack for turning scientific theories on their heads, seemed like just the man for the job. However, Pasteur wasn't exactly the first choice. In fact, he wasn't even a choice until the head of the Silk Commission, Jean-Baptiste Dumas, plucked him from his microbial pursuits and thrust him into the world of silkworms. Pasteur, who knew about as much about silkworms as a fish knows about flying, was initially reluctant. But he soon discovered that this wasn't just an insect issue, it was a scientific puzzle begging to be solved. Armed with his trusty microscope and an unyielding determination, Pasteur packed his bags and headed to the silk-producing region of Alès in the south of France. Picture him as a detective, trenchcoat flapping, magnifying glass in hand, ready to crack the case of the dying silkworms. The scene in Alès was grim. Silk farms looked like ghost towns, with abandoned cocoons and despondent farmers. Pasteur rolled up his sleeves. Metaphorically, of course, he was more of a lab coat kind of guy, and got to work. His approach was classic Pasteur, meticulous, methodical, and microscopic. He examined countless silkworms, their eggs, and even their droppings. It was a dirty job, but someone had to do it, and Pasteur was never one to shy away from a bit of grime in the name of science. His findings were groundbreaking. Pasteur discovered that pebrine was caused by a parasite invading the silkworms, a revelation that shifted the focus from environmental factors to biological ones. This was akin to discovering that your car trouble wasn't due to a flat tire, but because a mischievous gremlin was under the hood. Pasteur's diagnosis was spot on, but he didn't stop there. Identifying the problem was only half the battle. The real challenge was finding a solution. Here's where things get a bit cloak and dagger. Pasteur, in what could be described as a 19th-century version of espionage, began visiting silk farms undercover. He observed, took notes, and even collected samples, all without tipping off the competition. His findings were clear. The key to saving the silkworms lay in separating the healthy from the infected. Pasteur developed a method to inspect silkworm eggs under a microscope to detect the presence of the parasite before they hatched. This preventive measure was revolutionary. It was like installing a security system to catch a thief before they even entered the house. Adopting Pasteur's method required a cultural shift among silk producers. It wasn't just about accepting new scientific ideas, it was about changing age-old practices. Imagine trying to convince a chef to swap their grandmother's secret recipe for a new one. You can bet there were some raised eyebrows. But the results spoke for themselves. By 1870, the silk industry was back on its feet, all thanks to Pasteur's ingenuity. He had not only saved the industry, but also set a precedent for using scientific methods in agriculture, making him an inadvertent icon in the process. Pasteur's silk escapade is a testament to his tenacity and vision. He could have easily dismissed the silkworm crisis as outside his expertise, but instead he tackled it head-on, leaving an indelible mark on yet another industry. Moreover, his work in Alvarez laid the groundwork for future breakthroughs in understanding infectious diseases, a theme that would define the latter part of his career. Pasteur's journey through the silkworm debacle wasn't just about saving an industry, it was about proving that science could solve real-world problems. It was about using a microscope to peer into a world unseen, to uncover truths that others overlooked. And while Pasteur might not have become a fashion icon in the traditional sense, his lab coat became a symbol of scientific pursuit, a pioneer's armor in the battle against ignorance and disease. As we leave Pasteur in the midst of his silken triumph, one might wonder what's next for our scientific Sherlock. Well, stay tuned, because this tale is far from over. Pasteur's story continues to unfold, with more mysteries to solve and more lives to change. In the next act of his life, Pasteur will turn his gaze toward the world of medicine, where his discoveries will not only save industries, but countless lives. So hang tight, because Pasteur is just getting started, and the best is yet to come. With the silkworm crisis neatly tucked under his belt, Pasteur was ready to tackle the next big beast of his career: germs. Imagine a world where the very air you breathe was thought to be teeming with spontaneous life. People were convinced that diseases sprang up like weeds in a garden, a belief as charmingly naive as thinking a pizza delivery guy could spawn from thin air. But Pasteur was about to blow the lid off this microbial Pandora's box with a bold new theory. Welcome to the germ theory of disease, folks, where Pasteur proposed that tiny, invisible organisms were the culprits behind infections. It sounds obvious now, but at the time it was about as welcome as a skunk at a garden party. In the 1860s, the medical establishment was more inclined to blame bad air or imbalanced tumours for illness. Yet here was Pasteur, armed with his trusty microscope, ready to wage war on the unseen. Let's break it down. By 1865, Pasteur's studies on fermentation had already laid the groundwork. He had shown that microorganisms were responsible for turning wine into vinegar and milk sour. Now, he was ready to extend this concept to human disease. It was a leap of logic as daring as suggesting that cats could one day rule the internet. But in the world of science, Pasteur was onto something big. The stakes were enormous. Infectious diseases were the grim reapers of the 19th century, claiming lives like a relentless tax collector. Cholera, anthrax, and tuberculosis swept through populations with the subtlety of a wrecking ball. In 1865, cholera alone killed over 100,000 people in the French capital. The economic toll was staggering, hospitals were overwhelmed, and the workforce was being decimated faster than you could say quarantine. In the midst of this chaos, Pasteur's germ theory was a beacon of hope. He argued that if microorganisms could be identified and controlled, diseases could be prevented, not just treated. It was a radical idea, akin to suggesting that a spoonful of honey could catch more flies than a barrel of vinegar. But despite the promise, Pasteur faced an uphill battle against a skeptical medical community that clung to traditional beliefs like a toddler to a security blanket. Enter the skeptics, stage left. Picture the scene. A room full of stern-looking gentlemen, their expressions as stiff as their starched collars. They questioned Pasteur's findings with the fervour of a dogged detective. One notable naysayer was the German physician Rudolf Virchow, who dismissed germ theory as a flight of fancy. To them, Pasteur's ideas were as plausible as the existence of unicorns. But Pasteur, ever the tenacious terrier, refused to back down. He ramped up his efforts, conducting a series of bold experiments to prove his point. In one memorable demonstration, he exposed sheep to anthrax bacteria, showcasing how vaccinated animals survived while unvaccinated ones succumbed to the disease. It was as clear as a sunny day, at least to him. As the tension mounted, Pasteur realized he needed more than just scientific evidence, he needed public support. Enter Pasteur, the PR maven, a 19th-century influencer, before Instagram was a glint in anyone's eye. He understood that to win the hearts and minds of the public, he had to communicate his findings in a way that captured their imagination. Picture Pasteur on the streets, sharing anecdotes and engaging with the masses, his charisma as potent as his scientific prowess. He was a master storyteller, weaving narratives that simplified complex ideas into digestible bites. Pasteur's public lectures became popular events, drawing crowds eager to hear tales of invisible foes and microscopic battles. He was turning science into a spectacle, and it was working. Now, let's get to the part where Pasteur goes toe-to-toe with one of the most terrifying diseases of the era, rabies. This was a time when the mere mention of rabies could send shivers down the spine of even the bravest soul. Contracting rabies was a death sentence, with symptoms so horrific they seemed plucked from the pages of a horror novel. Pasteur's pursuit of a rabies vaccine was like a high-stakes thriller, complete with moments of triumph, despair, and even a street brawl with skeptics. Okay, maybe not a literal brawl, but the opposition was fierce. In 1885, Pasteur began experimenting with the rabies virus in a bid to create a vaccine. He faced criticism from the medical community, who accused him of recklessness. After all, rabies was a deadly disease, and experimenting with it was akin to juggling flaming torches, blindfolded. But Pasteur was undeterred. In July of that year, he tested his rabies vaccine on a 9-year-old boy named Joseph Meister, who had been bitten by a rabid dog. It was a moment of nail-biting tension, the kind that makes your heart pound like a drum. The stakes were life and death, and the world watched with bated breath. Remarkably, the boy survived, marking one of the first successful vaccinations against rabies. It was a victory that left skeptics reeling, and Pasteur hailed as a hero. This wasn't just a personal triumph, it was a watershed moment for medicine. Pasteur had not only saved a life, but demonstrated the power of vaccination in preventing disease. It was a concept that would change the course of medical history and pave the way for future immunizations. Of course, Pasteur's success didn't silence all the doubters. There were still those who viewed his methods as unorthodox, questioning the morality and safety of his experiments. Yet, much like a modern-day influencer dealing with trolls, Pasteur navigated the criticism with grace and determination. He continued to advocate for his work, understanding that the tide of public opinion could be a powerful ally. Pasteur's story is one of relentless persistence, a narrative that transforms science into an epic saga. It's a tale of a man who faced down critics and diseases with equal fervor, driven by an unshakable belief in his work. His journey from the vineyards of France to the forefront of medical science is a testament to the power of innovation and the courage to challenge the status quo. As we leave Pasteur on the brink of further discoveries, one thing is clear: his legacy is far from finished. The germ theory of disease would go on to revolutionize medicine, leading to the development of vaccines that have saved millions of lives. And while Pasteur himself may have left this world behind, his influence lingers on, a reminder that sometimes the smallest things, like germs, can have the biggest impact. Stay tuned, for the tale of Pasteur is not yet done. There are more mysteries to unravel, more battles to fight, and more lives to save. As Pasteur stood on the cusp of even more groundbreaking discoveries, perhaps he had a moment to ponder the legacy he was crafting. His germ theory had punched a gaping hole in the fabric of 19th-century medical understanding, like a rock through a stained-glass window. But what does a legacy truly mean when you're still in the throes of making history? For Pasteur, it was the promise of transforming not just medicine, but the very fabric of public health. A tapestry woven with threads of curiosity, tenacity, and a touch of controversy. Let's set the stage. By the time Pasteur was wrapping up his rabies triumph, the world was catching on to the seismic shift in medical paradigms. His ideas didn't just ripple through the scientific community, they made waves that crashed into the shores of everyday life. Thanks to Pasteur, hospitals began scrubbing their act quite literally as antiseptics became the new obsession. The world of surgery, previously as risky as a game of Russian roulette, saw mortality rates drop faster than a lead balloon. By 1870, surgeons in London reported a decrease in post-operative infections by over 30%, a testament to Pasteur's influence. But here's the kicker. Fame, much like a double-edged sword, was as perilous as it was rewarding. Pasteur found himself in the spotlight, a darling of the media and a target for critics. His name was splashed across newspapers, his visage etched into the public consciousness. Yet, navigating the choppy waters of celebrity wasn't all smooth sailing. The accolades came with an undertow of scrutiny and skepticism, the kind that could unnerve even the most stalwart of pioneers. Consider this. While Pasteur was hailed as a hero, some corners of the scientific community continued to nitpick his methods, questioning their rigor with the precision of a hungry hawk eyeing its prey. Critics accused him of overreaching, of playing God with microbial life. It was a classic case of tall poppy syndrome pluck, the tallest flowers before their shadows grow too long. Pasteur's work was groundbreaking, yes, but it also ruffled feathers, challenging the status quo and rattling cages that had long been left undisturbed. Now, if Pasteur were a social media influencer today, he'd likely be juggling hashtags like Science Savior and Zerm Guru while fielding comments from both fans and detractors. His timeline would be a thrilling mix of breakthroughs and backlashes, each post a microcosm of his larger-than-life persona. But would he be trending? You bet. His discoveries, wrapped in the drama of life and death, would be the stuff of viral legend. He'd be the poster child for innovation, a veritable rock star in a lab coat, with a following as loyal as it was critical. Yet amid the accolades and the criticisms, there was a man behind the microscope, a man as much a product of his era as a shaper of it. Pasteur was a son of the 19th century, a time when the Industrial Revolution was chugging along like a steam train on steroids. This era of rapid change and technological innovation provided fertile ground for his ideas to take root. But let's not romanticize it too much. This was also a time when societal norms could be as rigid as a Victorian corset. Pasteur had to navigate these constraints, maneuvering through a landscape that was as resistant to change as it was ripe for it. Economically, Pasteur's contributions were like a shot in the arm for industries battling invisible foes. His work on pasteurization alone was a game-changer, ensuring that beverages like milk could be safely consumed, a boon worth its weight in gold. This wasn't just about saving lives, it was about safeguarding livelihoods, stabilizing economies that were as fragile as a house of cards. By 1900, the pasteurization process had become an industry standard, slashing the incidence of milk-borne diseases by over 90% in urban areas. A testament to its efficacy and enduring impact. Reflecting on Pasteur's legacy is to acknowledge both the man and the myth. He was a visionary who dared to peer into the microcosm and see the potential for macro change. His work laid the foundation for modern microbiology and immunology, fields that continue to evolve, building on the scaffolding of his discoveries. Yet, Pasteur was also human, prone to the same foibles and follies as the rest of us. He was known to be fiercely competitive, sometimes to the point of being territorial over his discoveries. Such intensity, while driving innovation, also sparked rivalries that were as fiery as they were legendary. So, what does Pasteur's story tell us about legacy and significance? It's a reminder that greatness often comes wrapped in contradictions, that the road to revolutionizing fields is paved with both triumphs and trials. It's about the courage to question the unquestionable and to persist in the face of skepticism, all while maintaining a sense of humility amidst the accolades. As we bid adieu to Pasteur, let's remember him not just as a titan of science, but as a testament to the power of curiosity and the relentless pursuit of truth. In a world still grappling with pandemics and scientific skepticism, his legacy is a beacon, illuminating the path forward for those daring enough to follow. So, here's to Louis Pasteur. A man whose microscope uncovered more than just germs, it revealed the potential for a world transformed by science, one discovery at a time. If you've ever wondered what it's like to be a 16th-century Portuguese navigator, brace yourself for an adventure that makes your regular 9-to-5 look like a day at the beach. Meet our protagonist, a swashbuckling navigator whose idea of relaxation is navigating uncharted waters while clutching a map that resembles a toddler's doodle more than a reliable guide. You're smack in the middle of the age of exploration, a time when Portugal was busy turning the ocean into its own personal highway in search of the ultimate prize, spices. The year is 1510, and you're about to embark on a voyage that's as financially risky as investing in Beanie Babies at the turn of the millennium. Why all the fuss over spices, you ask? Well, back in the day, black pepper was worth its weight in gold, literally. In fact, a pound of black pepper could fetch up to half a ducat, which might not sound like much until you realize that a skilled laborer made just a few ducats a year. Add to that the allure of cloves, nutmeg, and cinnamon, and you have yourself a lucrative cocktail of economic motivation. But wait, there's more to this spice obsession than just flavoring your bland 16th century gruel. Spices were the medieval equivalent of a Swiss army knife. They preserved food, masked the stench of spoiled meat, and even served as medicinal remedies. Forget your multivitamins. Just sprinkle some cinnamon on that bubonic plague and call it a day. Plus, possessing exotic spices was the ultimate status symbol, turning any merchant into a Renaissance-era influencer. Now, while you're busy dreaming of a peppercorn-studded fortune, let's talk about the staggering costs of these expeditions. Outfitting a single ship could set you back a cool 30,000 ducats, and that's before you even factor in the cost of hiring a crew, buying provisions, and bribing the occasional pirate. Yet, despite the astronomical expenses, the potential return on investment was irresistible. Think of 400% profit margin on a successful voyage. Talk about high stakes. You'd need nerves of steel to take on such a venture, or perhaps just a healthy disregard for personal safety. As you prepare to set sail, clutching your trusty astrolabe and compass, you might glance at your map and start questioning your life choices. Let's be honest, 15th century maps are about as accurate as a game of telephone played by drunk pirates. With coastlines drawn like a child's scribble and entire continents misplaced, it's a wonder anyone made it anywhere without winding up in a Bermuda Triangle of confusion. The famed map of Martin Waldseemüller, for instance, depicted a giant uncharted landmass labelled America. Spoiler alert, it's not actually where America is. The stakes are high, the risks are real, and your navigational tools are sketchy at best. Yet, there's something undeniably thrilling about this era of exploration. It's a time when the world was both infinitely larger and smaller than we can imagine today, when the promise of fortune was matched only by the shadow of peril. As you stand on the deck, the salty breeze tangling your hair, you realize that in this world of uncertainty, one thing is clear. You're part of a grand adventure that will shape the course of history, or at least make for a heck of a story back at the tavern. So, ready your sea legs and steady your nerves, because this is just the beginning of a journey that will take you to the ends of the earth and back. Just remember, if the map seems a bit off, it's not you. It's the 16th century. As you stand on the deck, the salty breeze tangling your hair, you realize that in this world of uncertainty, one thing is clear. You're part of a grand adventure that will shape the course of history, or at least make for a heck of a story back at the tavern. But before you let the wind carry away your romantic notions, let's have a heart-to-heart about the nuts and bolts, or should I say, sails and rigging of this operation. Welcome to the gritty reality of 16th century maritime technology, where innovation often sailed hand in hand with desperation. First up in our nautical toolbox is the astrolabe, the medieval GPS that had about as much precision as a fortune cookie. Picture this, a nifty brass disc about the size of a dinner plate engraved with arcane symbols and dials. It's like a steampunk dream come true. This gizmo allowed navigators to measure the angle of the sun or a star above the horizon, thus calculating latitude with a margin of error that could leave you hundreds of miles off course. But hey, who's counting when you're aiming for a continent? Plus, it sure beats the old method of dead reckoning, which is exactly as ominous as it sounds. Guesswork with a side of optimism. Now, let's talk about the caravel. Ah, the caravel. Portugal's claim to maritime fame. This was the hot rod of the high seas, a sleek, nimble ship that could dance circles around the lumbering galleons of yore. With its lateen sails and shallow draught, the caravel was perfect for exploring uncharted waters and sneaking up on unsuspecting spice traders. And when it came to speed, this baby was the Ferrari of the ocean, capable of a brisk 8 knots on a good day. But don't let the romantic imagery fool you. Life aboard a caravel was less pirate's life for me, and more, how much salted fish can one man eat? Speaking of sustenance, let's dive into the culinary delights, or lack thereof, of life at sea. If you've ever complained about airplane food, prepare to have your mind blown by the medieval menu. Fresh fruit? not unless you count the weevils in your hardtack. Indeed, the ship's pantry was a veritable smorgasbord of dried, salted, and downright dubious provisions. Think ship's biscuit, essentially a brick masquerading as food salt pork that's more salt than pork, and the occasional cask of vinegary wine to wash it all down. On a bad day, you might find yourself gnawing on leather, literally, if the food ran out before the voyage ended. But the real villain in this maritime melodrama is scurvy, a disease that makes your dentist look like a saint. Caused by a lack of vitamin C, scurvy would turn the healthiest sailor into a walking horror show, bleeding gums, rotting teeth, and joints that ached like they'd been cursed by a vengeful witch. Vitamin C deficiency was the sailor's kryptonite, and without a lemon or lime in sight, it's no wonder that scurvy claimed more lives than storms or sea battles. It wasn't until the late 18th century that the British Navy figured out that citrus was the cure, earning their sailors the nickname limeys. But in our Navigator's time, you simply grinned and bared those toothless gums. While we're on the subject of unpleasant realities, let's not forget about hygiene, or the lack thereof. Imagine sharing cramped quarters with dozens of men for months on end, with no running water and a latrine arrangement that can only be described as medieval performance art. Bathing was more of a theoretical concept than a practical one, and the pungent aroma of a ship's hold could knock a seagull out of the sky. The ship was a microcosm of society, with all its smells and sounds, but crammed into a wooden box bobbing on the ocean. But enough about the less savoury aspects of seafaring life. Let's return to our navigator, who's busy charting a course through these murky waters. Every sunrise, he consults his charts and instruments, plotting a path that will hopefully lead to riches beyond imagination, or at least a safe return. It's a job that requires nerves of steel and a gambler's heart, for one wrong calculation could mean the difference between discovering new worlds or becoming a footnote in a sailor's tale of woe. Of course, while our navigator is busy playing celestial chess with the stars, there's also the matter of keeping the crew in line. These aren't just any old sailors. They're a ragtag band of adventurers, mercenaries, and opportunists, each with their own reasons for braving the ocean's fury. Some are seeking fortune, others redemption, and a few are simply running from their pasts. It's a melting pot of ambition and desperation, and our navigator must balance authority and camaraderie to keep this motley crew from mutiny. In this world of salt and sail, there's no place for the faint of heart. The stakes are high, the risks are real, and the rewards, well, they're the stuff of legend. As you navigate through this tale of exploration and endurance, remember that each day on the ocean was a roll of the dice, a wager on the whims of wind and wave. And while we may romanticize these voyages today, for those who lived them, it was a gritty, grinding reality, an odyssey of survival and ambition, charted on the uncertain seas of destiny. But fear not, for our journey has only just begun, and there are still many stories left to tell from the decks of history's most daring adventures. Stay tuned for the next chapter in this epic saga, where the promise of treasure and the spectre of peril loom large on the horizon. So you're still with me, ready to dive deeper into the choppy waters of 16th century exploration? Great. Buckle up, because it's time to explore the social and political maelstrom that defined these voyages. Picture the high seas as the ultimate chessboard, with Portugal and Spain as rival grandmasters, each determined to outmaneuver the other for global domination. Forget board games. This was a high-stakes geopolitical showdown with real-world consequences. Let's start with the Treaty of Tordesillas, the 1494 agreement that attempted to carve up the world like a Thanksgiving turkey. The Pope, like a celestial referee, drew an imaginary line through the Atlantic Ocean. Everything to the west of this line would belong to Spain, and everything to the east would belong to Portugal. Easy, right? Not exactly. The line's exact location was as clear as mud, which led to enough confusion and disputes to make a lawyer's head spin. In theory, this treaty was meant to keep the peace, but in practice it was like handing two toddlers a single toy and telling them to share. Spoiler alert, it didn't quite work out. The rivalry between Portugal and Spain was more than just a game of nautical monopoly. These two nations were like the Coke and Pepsi of the age of exploration, each vying for the title of supreme sea power. For Portugal, the stakes were personal. They had been the trailblazers, the first to round the treacherous Cape of Good Hope and reach the riches of the Indian Ocean. But Spain, with its discovery of the New World, had suddenly become the cool kid on the block, and Portugal wasn't about to let them hog the spotlight. Enter the Age of Alliances, where treaties were signed with the same frequency as celebrity divorces. Portugal and Spain both played the diplomatic game with a mix of cunning and desperation, forging alliances with various European powers while keeping a wary eye on each other. In this era, alliances were as stable as a house of cards in a hurricane, prone to collapse at the slightest provocation. And yet, they were crucial. Without them, the balance of power could shift faster than a ship changing course. But let's zoom in a bit. While kings and popes were busy redrawing maps, life aboard a Portuguese vessel was a different story. Imagine a floating social experiment where class distinctions were as rigid as the ship's mast. At the top of the hierarchy was the captain, the lord of this wooden kingdom, whose word was law. Beneath him, the officers and skilled navigators, wielding their astrolabes with a mix of expertise and guesswork. And then there was the crew, a motley collection of sailors, each with their own backstory and agenda. Think of the crew as a reality TV cast, minus the cameras and with a bit more scurvy. You had the hardened veterans, grizzled seafarers who had seen more storms than you've had hot dinners. Then there were the greenhorns, fresh-faced and gullible, lured by the promise of adventure and riches. And finally, the wildcards, mercenaries and opportunists, eager to make a quick ducat, even if it meant bending the rules. It was a delicate ecosystem of ambition and survival, where alliances were forged and broken with alarming regularity. Mutiny was the ever-present spectre haunting these ships, a constant reminder that authority was only as strong as the men who respected it. Picture this: a captain's unpopular decision, a dwindling supply of food, and a crew pushed to the brink. It didn't take much to ignite the tinderbox of discontent, and many a voyage ended not in triumph but in chaos, with captains overthrown and the ship's course altered by the whims of the mutineers. In this Darwinian drama, survival required more than just skill. It demanded charisma, cunning, and sometimes a well-timed compromise. But why, you might wonder, did these men risk so much? The answer lies in the promise of wealth and the lure of the unknown. For many, the sea was a ticket to a better life, a chance to escape poverty and obscurity. A successful voyage could transform a penniless sailor into a wealthy merchant, his pockets jingling with the profits of the spice trade. And then there was the sheer thrill of exploration, the chance to see lands and peoples beyond the wildest dreams of any armchair adventurer back home. Yet, beneath the romantic veneer of exploration lay the harsh reality of empire building. These voyages were not just about discovery, they were about conquest and control. The Portuguese weren't just navigating, they were negotiating, often at the point of a sword. Ports were seized, treaties were signed under duress, and native populations were subjugated in the name of progress. It was a brutal business, one that left scars on the world map and on the souls of those who participated. As our navigator charts his course across the Atlantic, he is acutely aware of these dynamics. Each decision he makes is a calculated gamble, not just with his own life, but with the lives of his crew and the fortunes of the empire he represents. It's a high-wire act with no net, where the stakes are life, death, and the future of nations. And yet, for all the danger and uncertainty, there is a strange beauty to it, a testament to the indomitable human spirit that drives us to explore the unknown, even when the risks are astronomical. So, as our story unfolds, keep in mind that this is more than just a tale of adventure on the high seas. It's a snapshot of a world in flux, where the boundaries of the known and unknown were being redrawn with every voyage. It's a world where ambition and desperation danced a perilous tango, where the promise of glory was matched only by the spectre of ruin. And as our navigator continues his journey, remember that each wave he crosses brings him closer to destiny or disaster. Stay with us, because this is just the beginning of the saga, and there are still many more nautical miles to cover on this grand voyage of discovery and intrigue. But here's the kicker. For all the talk of destiny and discovery, there's an elephant, or perhaps a sea monster, in the room that we need to address, the myth-making machine that was the age of exploration. You see, history has a way of giving these navigators the Hollywood treatment, turning them into larger-than-life heroes, brave David slinging stones at the Goliath of the unknown. But peel back the layers of this narrative, and what do you find? Spoiler alert, a whole lot of spin doctoring. Take the case of Vasco da Gama, Portugal's poster boy for maritime glory. Sure, he was the first to reach India by sea, a feat that earned him accolades and a place in every history book from Lisbon to Timbuktu. But scratch beneath the surface of this triumphal tale and you glimpse the not-so-glamorous side of his mission. Da Gama's letters and logs reveal a man who wasn't just interested in trade, but in domination. His tactics included a bit of good old-fashioned intimidation, like bombarding coastal towns to extract favourable trade terms. Yeah, not exactly the stuff of Disney movies. And then there's the propaganda machine back home. King Manuel I of Portugal wasn't just in the business of exploration, he was in the business of selling it. Reports of voyages, heavily edited and dramatized, were circulated to boost national pride and justify the kingdom's aggressive expansion. The spin was so good that it would make modern PR firms green with envy. These tales of bravery and discovery conveniently glossed over the bloodshed and exploitation that came hand in hand with empire building. Consider the indigenous populations, who in these stories are often reduced to mere footnotes or exotic curiosities. The romanticized encounters between navigators and native peoples were often anything but. Take, for instance, the infamous encounter between da Gama's crew and the Zamorin of Calicut. The Portuguese expected the locals to roll out the red carpet, showering them with spices and gold. Instead, they found themselves embroiled in a complex web of local politics, where their demands were met with skepticism and resistance. Not exactly the fairy tale welcome party, but why did these myths persist, you ask? Well, they were as appealing then as they are now. They fed into a narrative of Western superiority, of the noble explorer bringing civilization to the world's wild frontiers. It was a storyline that justified not only the voyages themselves, but also the brutal methods employed to secure trade routes and resources. For a kingdom like Portugal, eager to establish itself as a global power, these tales were invaluable currency. And let's not forget the economic angle. The crown wasn't just in it for the glory, there were serious ducats at stake. With trade monopolies on the line, portraying these voyages as noble quests rather than aggressive takeovers helped keep the coffers full and the populace supportive. After all, when your country's GDP is riding on the prow of a ship, you want to make sure the folks back home are cheering, not jeering. But back to our navigator, who's navigating not only the high seas but also the murky waters of empire and myth. Each decision he makes must balance the demands of his sovereign with the realities of the lands he encounters. It's a tightrope walk between diplomacy and force, between the promise of profit and the threat of peril. For him, the legends being spun back in Lisbon are both a blessing and a curse. They elevate his status, but they also obscure the hard truths of his journey. So as you chart your own course through these tales of exploration, keep a skeptical eye on the stories that have come down through the ages. Remember that history is often written by the victors, and those victors had a vested interest in painting themselves in the best possible light. The romance of the age of exploration is real, but so too is its gritty, often brutal reality. And as our navigator presses onward, his eyes fixed on the horizon, he is ever aware of the dual nature of his mission. He is at once a seeker of fortune and a pawn in a larger game of empire, a man whose name might one day be sung in taverns and written in books, but whose true story, like the sea itself, is both vast and unfathomable. Stay tuned, because the waves of history are still rolling, and our voyage is far from over. As our navigator presses onward, eyes fixed on the horizon, he is ever aware of the dual nature of his mission. He is at once a seeker of fortune and a pawn in a larger game of empire, a man whose name might one day be sung in taverns and written in books, but whose true story, like the sea itself, is both vast and unfathomable. And with that, let's dive into the ripples these navigations sent across the globe, creating waves in history that we're still riding today. First up, let's chat about the economic fireworks that these voyages ignited. You see, the Age of Discovery wasn't just about planting flags and snapping up selfies with the locals. Oh no, it was about cash, big, sparkling piles of it. Enter the spice trade, the 16th century's version of Bitcoin. The Portuguese, with their head start, were cashing in like it was nobody's business. By establishing sea routes to India and beyond, they bypassed the overland trade routes dominated by the Ottomans and Venetians. This was the medieval equivalent of cutting out the middleman and boy, did it pay off. We're talking profit margins that could make a Wall Street broker weep tears of envy. However, this wasn't just about pepper and cloves. These voyages spun a web of global trade networks that knitted the world together in new and often unsettling ways. Before you knew it, goods were zipping across the globe like never before. Silk and porcelain from China, silver from the Americas, and, of course, spices from the East, all flowing through the arteries of the new global economy. The world was shrinking, my friend, faster than you can say spice rack. Yet, while the economic gains were making some folks very rich, they weren't exactly an equal opportunity employer. The rise of these global trade networks came with a dark underbelly, the beginnings of colonial exploitation. For the Portuguese, the spice trade was only the tip of the iceberg. As they expanded their reach, they also laid the groundwork for colonial empires that would reshape continents and lives. Take, for instance, the establishment of trading posts and colonies in Goa, Malacca, and Macau. These weren't just pit stops, they were the front lines of a new colonial order. The Portuguese, much like their European counterparts, were not shy about using force to get what they wanted. Treaties were signed at sword point, and local rulers found themselves caught in a vice of European ambition. The balance of power shifted, and in many places it was the beginning of centuries of foreign domination. The age of discovery wasn't just about finding new worlds, it was about owning them. Now, here's where the story gets as tangled as a sailor's knot. For all the talk of discovery and progress, these navigations sowed the seeds of a legacy that's as complex as it is controversial. On the one hand, they opened the world up to new ideas, technologies, and cultural exchanges. The Renaissance, with its explosion of art, science, and philosophy, owed much to the influx of knowledge and goods from these voyages. The world was changing, and in many ways it was for the better. But flip that coin, and you'll see a darker side. The Age of Discovery also marked the dawn of the transatlantic slave trade, a horrific chapter in history that cost millions of lives and left scars that have yet to heal. The same ships that carried spices and silks also transported human beings, shackled and stolen from their homelands, to be sold into slavery. It was a brutal system, driven by the very economic forces that these voyages unleashed. In the end, the legacy of these navigations is a tapestry woven with threads of triumph and tragedy. They were quests for glory that brought both enlightenment and exploitation, riches and ruin. The irony is as thick as a fog bank. These voyages, meant to bring the world closer, often tore it apart. They connected continents and cultures, but also laid the groundwork for colonialism and its long, painful shadow. As you ponder this maritime saga, remember that history, like the ocean, is vast and deep, filled with both wonders and horrors. The Age of Discovery was a time of daring and dreams, but also one of greed and brutality. Our Navigator, a small cog in the great machine of empire, was part of a story that is still being written today. His actions, and those of his fellow explorers, set in motion forces that reshaped the world in ways that were both magnificent and monstrous. So, as our day at sea draws to a close, take a moment to reflect on the double-edged sword of exploration. It's a tale of human ambition in all its glory and infamy, a reminder that our greatest achievements often come with a cost. The navigator's journey may be over, but the waves he helped create continue to ripple across the ages, shaping the world we live in today. And as the sun sets on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the endless sea, remember this: history is more than just a collection of dates and deeds. It's a living, breathing narrative, as complex and contradictory as the ocean itself. Alexandria in 3070 AD was the kind of place that would make any cosmopolitan swoon if they could get past the pungent smell of the harbour and the relentless sun first. This was a city where the ancient world's brainiacs rubbed elbows, exchanging ideas like they were trading the secrets to the universe. Enter through the city gates, and you might find yourself dodging a camel or two, but more importantly, you'd be stepping into a cultural stew that's been simmering since its founding by Alexander the Great in 331 BC. This city was buzzing with the intellectual energy of scholars from across the Mediterranean. Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, Romans, and more threw their ideas into the ring, often with a side of philosophical fisticuffs. At the heart of this intellectual circus stood the Library of Alexandria, a place so legendary that even today it's remembered as the Mount Everest of ancient knowledge. With an estimated 400,000 to 700,000 scrolls at its peak, this wasn't your average public library. It was the Google of the ancient world, minus the search engine, and plus a lot of papyrus. Now, in the midst of this hive of activity, our heroine Hypatia was growing up. But before we dive into her story, let's talk about her dad, Theon. He wasn't just any father, he was the kind of dad who would make sure his daughter was equipped with the finest education, even if it meant challenging societal norms. Theon was a mathematician and astronomer, one of the last scholars to work at the Great Library. He was the kind of guy who probably had an abacus in one hand and a star chart in the other. Theon wasn't content with just letting Hypatia doodle in the sand. No, he was determined to shape her into a scholar. And in a world where women were expected to focus more on weaving than on theorems, this was nothing short of revolutionary. Theon taught her everything he knew about mathematics and astronomy, and Hypatia soaked it up like a sponge. Picture a young girl not playing with dolls, but scribbling complex equations and charting the stars. Because, really, who needs a dollhouse when you have the universe? Hypatia's education was a radical divergence from the norm. In an era where women were often relegated to the sidelines, she was stepping right into the intellectual spotlight. Women in ancient Greece had about as much say in their lives as a fish at a fish market. They were expected to marry, bear children, and stay out of the male-dominated public sphere. But Hypatia? She was having none of it. She was the outlier, the exception to the rule, and she was just getting started. Now, let's not romanticize this too much. Sure, Hypatia was a trailblazer, but she was one of very few women who had the opportunity to break the mold. The ancient world wasn't exactly teeming with female mathematicians and philosophers. Hypatia was the exception because her father had the means, the knowledge, and the sheer audacity to defy the societal norms of his time. So here we have Hypatia, a product of her father's unorthodox vision and the bustling, intellectually charged atmosphere of Alexandria. She was poised to become a figure who would not only challenge preconceptions about what women could achieve, but also leave a mark on the world of science and philosophy that would echo through the ages. Her story was just beginning, and trust me, it was going to be an epic tale of genius, grit, and a fair bit of ancient drama. Stay tuned, because the ride through Hypatia's life is only going to get more fascinating. Hypatia's story was just beginning, and trust me, it was going to be an epic tale of genius, grit, and a fair bit of ancient drama. Stay tuned, because the ride through Hypatia's life is only going to get more fascinating. Speaking of fascinating, let's mosey on over to the Neoplatonic school, where Hypatia really hit her intellectual stride. This wasn't just some dusty classroom with scrolls piled to the ceiling. No, this was the ancient world's version of TED Talks, except instead of hashtags, you got direct teachings from the likes of Hypatia. If you were looking for wisdom, this was the place to be. Hypatia became the head honcho at the Neoplatonic school in Alexandria, a feat that would make even the most seasoned philosopher do a double take. In a world where women were more often seen than heard, Hypatia was not just heard, she was listened to. She taught philosophy, mathematics, and astronomy, drawing students from all over the Mediterranean. Imagine being a young scholar and travelling miles just to catch a glimpse of Hypatia's brilliance in action. You'd have to deal with seasickness, sandstorms, and the odd pirate, but hey, wisdom doesn't come easy. Now, Hypatia wasn't your run-of-the-mill philosopher. If you were expecting a standard lecture, you were in for a surprise. Her teaching style was as unconventional as her path to the podium. She was known to mix deep philosophical discussions with practical demonstrations, a method that left more than a few students scratching their heads, and not just because of lice. One moment, she'd be explaining the intricacies of Platonic thought. The next, she'd be drawing geometric figures in the sand. It was like attending a class that was part Socratic dialogue, part magic show. One of Hypatia's most significant contributions was her work on conic sections. Now, I know what you're thinking, conic sections? Really? But bear with me. These are the shapes you get when you slice through a cone at different angles, a concept that's fundamental to the fields of geometry and calculus. It's the stuff that makes modern engineering and space exploration possible. So, if you've ever marveled at a rocket launch or a suspension bridge, you've got a little bit of Hypatia to thank. Then there were the astrolabes. These nifty devices were the ancient world's equivalent of a GPS. They helped sailors navigate the treacherous seas by mapping the stars. Hypatia didn't just understand how they worked, she improved upon them. Imagine being on a ship in the middle of the Mediterranean, and instead of looking blankly at the night sky, you have a tool that can tell you your position with reasonable accuracy. It's like having Google Maps, but instead of satellites, you're relying on celestial bodies. Hypatia's work in refining these instruments was crucial, and it's a testament to her genius that her contributions are still recognized today. But let's not forget the human element in all this intellectual triumph. Hypatia's students were a mixed bag, hopefuls dreaming of philosophical glory, skeptics who thought they knew it all, and a fair share of those who were simply there to say they studied with the great Hypatia. Some probably expected a stodgy old man with a long beard and were taken aback when they found a woman at the helm. Hypatia's presence was a challenge to their preconceptions, a living, breathing refutation of what they thought they knew about who could be a philosopher. Her students often left with more questions than answers, which was precisely the point. Hypatia wasn't interested in telling people what to think, she was teaching them how to think. Her approach was about awakening curiosity, sparking debates, and encouraging a relentless pursuit of knowledge. These were lessons that went beyond the lecture hall, shaping minds that would, in turn, shape the world. Of course, it wasn't all smooth sailing. Hypatia's success ruffled more than a few feathers. Her prominence in a male-dominated field was a source of admiration for some and resentment for others. She was a polarizing figure, admired by many, but also a target for those who couldn't stomach the idea of a woman outshining them. The world of ancient academia wasn't exactly a bastion of equality, and Hypatia's brilliance shone a spotlight on the gender biases of her time. Despite the challenges, Hypatia remained unyielding in her quest for knowledge. Her story is a testament to the power of education, the importance of challenging societal norms, and the impact one determined individual can have on the world. She was a philosopher, a mathematician, an astronomer, and above all, a teacher who left an indelible mark on history. Her journey was far from over, and neither is our exploration of her life. We've just begun to scratch the surface of what made Hypatia not just a scholar, but a legend. So stay tuned, because the story of Hypatia is about to take some unexpected turns that you won't want to miss. And just like that, we find ourselves diving headfirst into the political hotbed of Alexandria during Hypatia's lifetime. Forget the intellectual paradise we've been waxing poetic about. Imagine a city teetering on the edge of chaos, where philosophical debates could turn into street brawls faster than you could say, Socrates. Welcome to Alexandria, circa the late 4th and early 5th century, a place where religious tensions between pagans and Christians were as thick as the dust in the desert air. At the center of this turmoil were two heavyweight figures, Cyril of Alexandria and Orestes. Cyril, the patriarch of Alexandria, was the kind of guy who would have thrived in modern politics, ambitious, cunning, and not above using a little divine intervention to get his way. He was a staunch defender of the Christian faith, and he wasn't about to let some pagan philosophers or their fans get in his way. On the other side, you had Orestes, the Roman prefect of the city. A civil servant through and through, Orestes was all about keeping the peace and maintaining order, which, in a city as volatile as Alexandria, was about as easy as herding cats. Now Hypatia, our brilliant philosopher, found herself caught in the crossfire of this ecclesiastical and political slugfest. Her affinity for Neoplatonism, a philosophy that didn't exactly align with Christian doctrine, put her in a precarious position. Despite her non-involvement in the political arena, her status as a prominent intellectual made her a symbol of pagan wisdom and therefore a target. It's like being the star player in a game you didn't even know you were part of. Enter Synesius of Cyrene, one of Hypatia's most famous students who would later become a bishop. In his letters, Synesius paints a picture of Hypatia, not as a revolutionary martyr, but as a respected sage, a beacon of wisdom whose house was a hub of intellectual activity. He writes with admiration, capturing the essence of a woman whose intellect transcended the petty squabbles of her day. But while Synesius saw Hypatia as an intellectual powerhouse, others saw her as a convenient scapegoat. In a city rife with tension, rumors were as common as sand grains. Hypatia was accused of fomenting discord between Cyril and Orestes, a claim that had about as much substance as a mirage. Yet, in the charged atmosphere of Alexandria, facts were often less persuasive than fervor. This is where the myth of Hypatia as a martyr for science starts to take root. It's a romantic notion, isn't it? A lone philosopher standing against the tide of ignorance, her death symbolizing the triumph of zealotry over reason. But hold your horses. Before we get swept away by the allure of this narrative, let's take a closer look. While Hypatia's tragic end is often framed as a clash between science and religion, the reality was far messier. Her murder in 415 AD by a Christian mob wasn't just about her beliefs or her teachings. It was a confluence of power struggles, misogyny, and a society in turmoil. To reduce her legacy to a simple narrative of victimhood does a disservice to her actual contributions. Hypatia wasn't just a symbol, she was a living, breathing scholar whose work in mathematics and astronomy has reverberated through the ages. Speaking of her contributions, let's not forget her role in refining mathematical concepts that would eventually underpin fields like calculus centuries later. Hypatia's work on the commentary on Diophantus and her potential involvement in the development of the astrolabe aren't just footnotes in history, they're testaments to her enduring legacy. She was a thinker of her time and beyond, a fact that often gets overshadowed by her dramatic end. But let's not sugarcoat it. Alexandria was a tough gig. The economy was as unpredictable as the politics. Grain, the lifeblood of Egypt and the Roman Empire, was a constant source of tension, with supply and demand affecting everything from bread prices to social unrest. Wealth flowed through the city like the Nile, but so did poverty, and the divide between rich and poor was as stark as the desert sun. In this environment, knowledge was both a commodity and a weapon. Scholars were revered, but they were also expected to toe the line or face the consequences. Hypatia's status afforded her a level of protection, but it also painted a target on her back. Her intellectual prowess was admired by many, but it threatened those who saw her as an embodiment of the old pagan order. Despite all this, Hypatia remained steadfast in her dedication to teaching and learning. She wasn't about to let political machinations deter her from her pursuit of knowledge. Her story, while tragic, isn't just about her death, it's about her life, her achievements, and the indelible mark she left on history. It's about a woman who defied the odds and became a legend, not because she was a victim, but because she was a visionary. So, as we continue to unravel the tale of Hypatia, let's remember that history is rarely black and white. It's a tapestry of complexities, contradictions, and the relentless march of human ambition. Hypatia's life was no exception, and her legacy is a testament to the power of intellect and the enduring quest for truth in a world that often prefers easy answers. The story of Hypatia is far from over, and as we delve deeper into her life, we'll uncover even more layers to this remarkable tale. Stay tuned, because the best is yet to come. In the swirling chaos of Alexandria's streets, where every corner held a story and every alley whispered secrets, Hypatia's saga was reaching its tragic crescendo. The year was 415 AD, not exactly a golden era for rational discourse or peaceful coexistence. Alexandria, that once glorious hub of intellect and culture, was now a powder keg waiting for a spark. And like any good historical drama, it had all the elements, ambition, rivalry, and an unhealthy dose of fanaticism. Hypatia found herself at the intersection of a bitter feud between Cyril, the Patriarch of Alexandria, and Orestes, the Roman prefect. Think of it as the ancient world's version of a heavyweight title fight, but instead of boxing gloves, they used political influence and theological fervor. Cyril, a man whose ambition could probably move pyramids, saw Christianity's ascendancy as his divine mandate. Orestes, on the other hand, was trying to keep the city from imploding under the weight of its religious and social tensions. It was like trying to juggle flaming swords while riding a unicycle blindfolded. Now Hypatia, with her Neoplatonic teachings and her status as a leading intellectual, was inadvertently swept up in this storm. Despite minding her own business, her philosophical leanings made her a convenient scapegoat. It's a bit like showing up to a toga party in a business suit and wondering why everyone's giving you the side eye. Except, in this case, the side eye came with torches and a mob mentality. The infamous riot that led to Hypatia's murder was a culmination of simmering tensions. Imagine a city where political power plays were as common as sandstorms, and you'll start to get the picture. People weren't just picking sides, they were picking weapons. In March of 415, A mob of Christian zealots, whipped into a frenzy by false accusations and a good dose of hysteria, dragged Hypatia from her chariot. It was less of a philosophical debate and more of a medieval horror story. Hypatia was brutally murdered, her body mutilated in a church, an ironic twist that would have been darkly humorous if it weren't so tragic. She was literally torn apart by the very city she had dedicated her life to enlightening. It was an act that highlighted the absurdity of how scientific brilliance could be so easily overshadowed by fanaticism. Her death was not just a loss for Alexandria, but for the entire intellectual world, a grim reminder of how fragile the pursuit of knowledge can be in the face of ignorance and fear. In the aftermath, the myths around Hypatia began to take shape. She was transformed into a symbol, a martyr for science, a tragic heroine crushed under the wheels of religious zealotry. It's a narrative that's as compelling as it is simplistic, reducing the complex socio-political landscape of her time to a neat parable about the clash between reason and faith. The truth, as always, was far messier. Her murder was the result of a toxic mix of power struggles, gender politics, and a city on the brink of chaos. As for the economic backdrop, let's not forget that Alexandria's wealth was built on trade, particularly the grain trade, which was as volatile as its politics. The city's prosperity depended on its ability to feed not just its own population, but also to supply the Roman Empire. This made the stakes incredibly high, and tensions over resources often spilled over into violence. In this context, knowledge was both a tool of empowerment and a potential threat to those who wielded power. Despite the grim circumstances, the legend of Hypatia endured, growing larger with each retelling. Her story became a rallying cry for those who saw her as a beacon of enlightenment, a symbol of what the world could be if only it embraced reason over dogma. But let's not get carried away by the romance of it all. The real Hypatia was a woman of flesh and blood, a scholar whose contributions to mathematics and astronomy were overshadowed by the drama of her death. In the centuries following her murder, Hypatia's legacy was reinterpreted by each new generation. Renaissance humanists saw her as a symbol of lost knowledge, while Enlightenment thinkers used her as a cautionary tale about the dangers of religious extremism. Each era projected its own hopes and fears onto her story, turning her into a mirror reflecting the struggles of their own time. But if we peel back the layers of mythology, we find a woman whose true legacy lies not in her death, but in her life's work. Hypatia's contributions to mathematics, particularly her work on conic sections, laid the groundwork for future discoveries in geometry and calculus. Her efforts to refine the astrolabe, a device that guided sailors across the seas, were instrumental in expanding the horizons of exploration. Despite the tragedy of her end, Hypatia's story is a testament to the enduring power of knowledge. It reminds us that even in the darkest times, the quest for understanding continues. Her life was a beacon of light in an age of darkness, and her legacy is a reminder that the pursuit of truth is a journey worth taking, no matter the obstacles. As we approach the final chapter of Hypatia's story, let's keep in mind that history is never as simple as it seems. It's a complex tapestry of human ambition, folly, and the relentless pursuit of knowledge. Hypatia's life and death are woven into that tapestry, a poignant reminder of the heights we can reach and the depths we can fall. Stay with us as we explore the aftermath of her death and the enduring impact of her legacy on future generations. The story of Hypatia is far from over, and the lessons it holds are as relevant today as they were in the dusty streets of ancient Alexandria. With the dust of ancient Alexandria settling, and Hypatia's legacy hanging in the balance, it's time to sift through the myths and marvels she left behind. Picture this. A woman who lived over a millennium ago, yet still manages to crash into our modern consciousness like an intellectual meteor. Hypatia's life may have ended in tragedy, but her impact reverberates through the annals of history, leaving a trail of inspiration for generations of scientists and philosophers alike. Let's talk numbers. Hypatia's contributions to mathematics and astronomy are a testament to her intellectual prowess. Sure, we might not have the luxury of leafing through a Hypatia-authored bestseller, but her work on conic sections and her enhancement of the astrolabe have survived the ravages of time. These weren't just idle exercises in geometry. They were the precursors to the mathematical foundations that would support the development of calculus centuries later. If you've ever marveled at the trajectory of a rocket, a bridge's elegant arch, or the precision of your GPS, you owe a nod to Hypatia's groundbreaking contributions. But here's the kicker. Despite her fame, much of Hypatia's original work is lost to history, tantalizingly out of reach like a delicious secret just beyond our grasp. Her legacy was preserved not through her own writings, but through the works of her students and the scholars she inspired. It's a bit like a game of intellectual telephone, where her ideas were passed down, adapted, and expanded upon, ensuring her influence endured even as the sands of time buried her own words. Fast forward a few centuries, and you'll find Enlightenment thinkers holding Hypatia up as a symbol of lost knowledge and reason, a beacon in the dark ages of superstition. Voltaire, that sassy French philosopher with a penchant for wit, championed Hypatia as a martyr for science and reason. He wasn't alone. The Enlightenment's love affair with Hypatia was less about the specifics of her work and more about what she represented, an intellectual rebel who stood for the pursuit of knowledge in the face of ignorance and fanaticism. But let's not kid ourselves. Hypatia's story has been romanticized to the point where it's practically a blockbuster script. Hollywood, with its flair for drama, couldn't resist turning her tale into a spectacle, complete with the requisite tragic ending. The 2009 film Agora, starring Rachel Weisz, painted Hypatia as a lone voice of reason amid the chaos of religious conflict, a portrayal as captivating as it is oversimplified. The real Hypatia was a complex figure, a product of her time, navigating the murky waters of politics and philosophy with the grace of a trapeze artist over a pit of alligators. And while the romantic narratives are undeniably compelling, they often overshadow the gritty realities of her era. Alexandria wasn't just a city of scholars and scrolls, it was a hotbed of economic and political tension. Grain was the city's lifeblood, and the whims of the market could turn prosperity into pandemonium faster than you could say Pax Romana. Hypatia's life unfolded against this backdrop, a world where knowledge was both a currency and a weapon. So, what would Hypatia make of her posthumous fame? I like to imagine her sitting in a celestial armchair, sipping ambrosia and shaking her head with a bemused smile. She'd probably marvel at the irony of being celebrated as a martyr when her life was dedicated to the living pursuit of knowledge, not the drama of her demise. Perhaps she'd chuckle at the thought of Enlightenment philosophers and Hollywood directors squabbling over her legacy like seagulls over a particularly tasty chip. In the grand tapestry of history, Hypatia's legacy is a vibrant thread that reminds us of the power of intellect and the importance of questioning the world around us. Her story is a testament to the enduring quest for understanding, a journey that continues to inspire even today's thinkers and dreamers. It's a reminder that knowledge, once kindled, is an unstoppable force, capable of piercing the darkest of times with its light. As we wrap up our journey through Hypatia's life, let's remember that her story is more than just a cautionary tale about the clash of reason and fanaticism. It's a celebration of human curiosity and resilience, a call to continue the pursuit of truth, no matter the obstacles. In a world still grappling with divisions and uncertainties, Hypatia's legacy challenges us to rise above the noise and seek the wisdom that lies beyond. And with that, we bid farewell to the remarkable Hypatia, an intellectual powerhouse, a reluctant martyr, and a timeless symbol of the triumph of knowledge over ignorance. As history continues to unfold, her story remains a guiding light, illuminating the path for future generations of seekers and scholars. So, the next time you gaze up at the stars or ponder the intricacies of an equation, spare a thought for Hypatia, the ancient scholar who dared to dream of a universe bound only by the limits of human understanding.